Section 1: The Man Behind the Skyline. There is a silhouette that appears in almost every wide shot of Springfield. It rises above the rooftops, above the church spire, above the water tower, above every building that represents the civic life of this town. Two cooling towers, a squat industrial mass between them, a chain-link perimeter with warning signs that nobody reads anymore because they have been there so long they have become part of the landscape, like trees, like hills, like something that simply exists and therefore must be natural. The Springfield nuclear power plant does not look threatening. That is the point. It looks like a background detail. It looks like set dressing. It looks like the kind of thing your eye skips over when you are focused on the family in the foreground and the joke they are delivering and the couch they are sitting on. The plant is always there, and because it is always there, you stop seeing it. That is exactly what Charles Montgomery Burns intended. This video is going to take its time. There is no rush here. We are going to move through Springfield slowly and carefully, the way you might walk through a house you have lived in for years but never truly examined. We are going to look at the corners. We are going to look at what is behind the furniture. We are going to look at the man who built this town into what it is, not through dramatic confrontations or heroic villainy, but through the patient, methodical application of wealth and power over decades, through small cruelties compounded into enormous ones, through a series of decisions that each looked, on their own, like nothing more than business. Charles Montgomery Burns, Mr. Burns, Monty, the old man on the hill, the billionaire who cannot remember the name of the employee he has worked with for 36 years, the man who once blocked out the sun, the man who was shot by a baby, or was he? The man who glows in the dark after his weekly medical treatments, the man who has outlived every reasonable expectation of human biology, the man who owns Springfield in ways the town has never formally acknowledged, because formal acknowledgement would require the town to do something about it. When you lay out everything Burns has done across 36 seasons of this show, a picture emerges that is so complete, so internally consistent, and so deliberately constructed that it stops feeling like the accumulation of individual episode plots and starts feeling like the biography of a real person, a real monster. Not the kind that arrives dramatically with a declaration of evil intent, but the kind that operates quietly and systematically and is always already gone by the time the damage becomes visible. Let us start at the very beginning, not the beginning of the show, the beginning of Burns. The origin of Charles Montgomery Burns is scattered across dozens of episodes, delivered in fragments, almost never all at once. The show gives you pieces and lets you assemble them, and when you do, what you find is a man who has been shaped by wealth and cruelty for so long that he no longer distinguishes between the two. Burns was born into one of America's oldest and most powerful families, the Burns dynasty. This is not a family that earned its wealth through innovation or industry in any recognizable modern sense. This is old money. The kind of old money that predates the concept of income tax. The kind that built the country's infrastructure and then charged the country to use it. The kind that has been sitting in the same hands, accumulating interest, for so many generations that the original sin of its acquisition has been smoothed away by time and distance into something that just looks like inheritance. We are told across various episodes that young Montgomery Burns did not grow up in Springfield. He grew up in a world of servants and country houses and a childhood so insulated from ordinary human experience that empathy simply never had the opportunity to develop. There is a pivotal moment the show returns to on occasion, a memory Burns carries from his very early years that the show uses to explain the specific texture of his cruelty. As a small boy, Burns had a childhood friend, a teddy bear named Bobo. He loved this bear with the uncomplicated, total love that small children give to soft objects they have chosen as companions. And somewhere in his gilded, isolated childhood, he lost it. The bear was taken from him by circumstance, or by time, or by the carelessness of the adults around him, and Burns carried that loss forward into every decade of his life. The show uses Bobo as shorthand for Burns's humanity, a reminder that inside this ancient, malevolent billionaire, there is a child who once loved something simple and lost it, and was never the same afterward. But what is interesting, what the show does not always make explicit, is what a person does with that kind of early loss when they also have unlimited resources and a total absence of meaningful accountability. Some people who lose something irreplaceable as children become gentler, more attuned to loss in others, more careful about the things they love. Burns went the other direction. He decided that if loss was inevitable, then the solution was to own everything, to acquire so completely and so totally that nothing could be taken from him again. Not because it would prevent loss, but because the act of acquisition itself became the substitute for the thing he could never get back. Every terrible thing Burns does in 36 seasons of this show can be traced back to that same impulse. He does not accumulate power because he needs it. He does not hoard resources because he requires them. He does not dominate Springfield because the town poses any threat to him. He does it because the alternative, allowing anything to exist outside his control, produces in him a sensation that he has spent a century learning to avoid. The sensation of a small boy reaching for a teddy bear and finding empty air. Understanding this does not make Burns sympathetic. It makes him comprehensible. And comprehensibility is more useful than sympathy when you are trying to understand how a man can poison an entire town for decades and feel nothing about it. Now, the skyline, the cooling towers, the plant. Burns did not build the power plant in Springfield because Springfield was the ideal location for a nuclear facility. He built it there because Springfield was small enough to dominate, economically dependent enough to be grateful for the jobs, and geographically isolated enough that the regulatory oversight would be minimal. He chose Springfield the way a predator chooses territory, not based on what the territory offers, but based on what it lacks. What Springfield lacked, when Burns arrived, was any power structure capable of saying no to him. So he built his plant, and Springfield became his. The show establishes very early that the nuclear power plant is the economic engine of Springfield, not one of several employers. The employer, the plant provides the town's electricity. The plant employs a significant portion of the working population. The plant generates the tax revenue that funds the town's public services, however inadequately. Without the plant, Springfield's economy does not struggle. It collapses. And Burns has always known this. He has always known that his continued presence in Springfield is not a privilege he is granted by the town, but a form of leverage he holds over it. There is a moment in the early seasons where a political candidate tries to use Blinky the three-eyed fish as evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. It works, initially. The public is outraged. The candidate surges in the polls. Burns is forced to respond. And his response is so perfectly calibrated that it tells you everything about how he views his relationship with Springfield. He does not attempt to clean up the plant. He does not promise to address the violations. He invites the candidate to dinner, serves him Blinky, watches him eat the mutant fish on national television, and lets the optics do the rest. The candidate loses. Burns wins. The plant continues operating exactly as it was. What Burns understood, and what the show captures with uncomfortable accuracy, is that the residents of Springfield are not going to revolt against the source of their livelihood, no matter how much evidence accumulates that it is killing them. They cannot afford to. Economically, practically, psychologically. The plant is too embedded in the structure of their lives for its removal to feel like liberation. It would feel like destruction. And so every piece of evidence, every three-eyed fish, every luminous rat, every cracked cooling tower and contaminated water table gets absorbed into the background of daily life in Springfield. It becomes part of the landscape, like the cooling towers themselves, something your eye skips over. Burns spent decades engineering that skip. He did not do it through threats. He did not do it through violence. He did it through the most effective form of control ever devised. He made himself necessary. He made his presence the precondition for the town's survival. And once you have done that, once you have woven yourself into the economic fabric of a community so completely that you and the community share a circulatory system, you can do almost anything. Because whatever you do, the alternative is worse. That is the foundation. That is where everything else begins. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a business that happens to be harmful. It is a mechanism of control that happens to produce electricity. Those are very different things, and the distinction matters when you are trying to understand why the harm never stops, why the violations never get fixed, why 36 years of documented environmental damage produces no meaningful consequences for the man responsible. If the plant were simply a business, Burns would have occasional incentive to clean it up. Bad press is bad for business. Regulatory fines eat into margins. A shutdown costs money. But the plant is not primarily a business. It is the instrument through which Burns maintains dominion over a town. And for that purpose, the violations are not a liability. They are a feature. A plant that operates within legal parameters can be monitored, regulated, and potentially challenged. A plant that operates in a gray zone of permanent documented illegality, where the cost of compliance always somehow exceeds the cost of the fines, is a plant that exists in a permanent state of institutional leverage. The regulators need the plant to stay open because the town needs the electricity. Burns needs the violations to continue because they represent ongoing proof that he does not need to follow the rules. Every cracked cooling tower is a message. Every plutonium paperweight is a message. Every luminous rat is a message. The message is always the same. I am above this. I have always been above this. And there is nothing you can do about it. And Springfield, for 36 years, has received that message and responded in the only way it knows how. By watching the cooling towers rise against the sky and calling them part of the landscape, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if you are settling in for the night, hit subscribe so you never miss one of these. Now let us go deeper. Section 2. The Power Plant and the Poison. The official safety record of the Springfield nuclear power plant is one of the most quietly horrifying documents in the history of American fiction. 342 safety violations discovered during a single inspection, not accumulated over time, not the result of a long regulatory relationship between the plant and some government agency, found in one visit by one inspector. On one day, 342. To put that in context, a typical nuclear facility in the real world might accumulate a handful of minor violations over the course of years before triggering serious regulatory concern. A facility that accrues dozens faces the realistic prospect of shutdown. A facility with 342 documented violations is not a facility that has been operating carelessly. It is a facility that has been operating as though the concept of safety regulation does not apply to it, has never applied to it, and will not apply to it regardless of what any inspector finds or what any fine is levied. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it. Not because he did not have the money. Burns is a billionaire many times over. A man whose family wealth predates most of the country's financial institutions. $56 million is, to Charles Montgomery Burns, a rounding error. He refused because spending the money would mean acknowledging that the violations were real. And acknowledging that the violations were real would mean inviting the question that Burns has spent decades making sure nobody in Springfield is cognitively equipped to ask. What has all of this already done to the people who live here? Let us walk through some of those violations, because the show depicts them across dozens of episodes and almost always plays them for laughs and almost always moves on before the laugh has fully faded, and that speed, that narrative sleight of hand, is exactly how the show has been getting away with telling you something terrible for 36 years. The radioactive waste disposal situation at the power plant is, by any measure, catastrophic. The show depicts waste being dumped directly into bodies of water, into rivers, into waterways that feed into the same water supply that Springfield's residents drink from every day. It depicts waste being left on playgrounds, children's playgrounds, spaces specifically designed for the youngest and most biologically vulnerable members of the community. The show presents this as background detail, as the kind of thing Homer might stumble over on his way to somewhere else. And the laugh comes from the absurdity of it, from the disconnect between the casual presentation and the obvious horror of what is being described. But the waste is real within the show's universe. The contamination is real. The exposure is real. Every child who has played on those playgrounds, every family that has drunk from that water supply, every person who has breathed the air downwind of those cracked cooling towers has been absorbing the consequences of Burns's decision not to spend $56 million. There are luminous rats in the bowels of the facility. This is presented as a gag. A rat that glows in the dark because it has been so thoroughly saturated with radiation that its body has begun to emit light. In the real world, A bioluminescent rodent discovered inside a nuclear facility would trigger an immediate regulatory shutdown, a federal investigation, and a public health emergency. In Springfield, it is background detail, something you might notice if you looked closely at the walls during a scene set in the lower levels of the plant. Something that has been there long enough that the maintenance workers have probably stopped commenting on it. The cooling towers. The cooling towers in a nuclear facility are among its most critical safety systems. They manage the thermal output of the reactor, prevent overheating, and are the last line of defense against the kind of cascading failure that the word meltdown describes. The cooling towers at the Springfield plant are cracked, not slightly compromised, not showing early signs of wear. Cracked badly enough that they require patching. The show depicts them being patched with chewing gum. Chewing gum. The thermal management system for an active nuclear reactor has been repaired with the same material a 10-year-old uses to stick notes to a locker. And then there are the skeletons. The show mentions this once. It does not dwell on it. It does not return to it. It shows you, in passing, that there are human skeletons in the basement of the Springfield nuclear power plant, and then it moves forward into whatever the next beat of the scene requires. Human skeletons. In the basement of a working reactor facility. No explanation, no investigation, no names, no families notified. Just bones in a basement, present in the background of a show that has been running for 36 years, waiting for someone to ask the question the show has never asked out loud. Who were those people? How did they end up dead inside a nuclear power plant? How long have they been there? And why, in a facility that has been subject to at least one safety inspection thorough enough to find 342 other violations, did nobody report this? The answer, if the show has one, is implied across dozens of episodes about Burns's relationship with authority, with accountability, with the mechanisms society has developed to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening. Burns does not interact with those mechanisms the way a normal person does. He does not comply with them and resent the cost. He does not evade them and fear the consequences. He surrounds them. He insulates himself from them so completely, through money, through institutional relationships, through the accumulated weight of generations of political investment, that they simply do not reach him. The skeletons in the basement do not get reported because the people who might report them work for Burns, have always worked for Burns, and understand at some cellular level that their employment, their healthcare, their retirement, their ability to remain in the community they were born in, depends on their continued willingness to not see certain things. That is the plant. That is the physical reality of what Burns has built and what Burns has chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to fix. Now let us talk about what it has done to the town. Blinky the three-eyed fish is the show's most famous piece of environmental evidence. A fish caught in a river near the power plant, with a third eye growing from its forehead. The image is striking enough to have become iconic. It appears in news reports within the show's universe. It becomes a political issue. A gubernatorial candidate uses it as a campaign centerpiece. And then, as we discussed, Burns neutralizes the political threat, the candidate loses, and Springfield returns to normal. But Blinky does not go away. Blinky remains in the river, and the river continues to flow. And the water downstream of that river continues to be the water that Springfield's residents consume. If a fish in close proximity to the plant has developed an entirely new organ as a result of radiation exposure, what has the same exposure done to the organisms that have been living in that environment for longer? Fish are, biologically, quite sensitive to environmental contamination. They develop visible mutations relatively quickly and visibly. Humans are more resistant, more complex, more capable of absorbing damage without producing obvious external symptoms. The mutations in humans would be slower, subtler, distributed across generations, expressed in ways that are easier to attribute to other causes or to simply accept as normal because they have always been present. The show tells you what those mutations look like. It has been telling you since the first episode. The bulging eyes, the overbite, the four-fingered hands, the yellow skin, the cranial proportions that do not match standard human anatomy, the hair that defies gravity, the healing rate that allows a human body to survive falls, explosions, and impacts that would be uniformly fatal in any other context. These are the physical characteristics of every Springfield resident. Of every person who has grown up in this town, drunk this water, breathed this air, and lived their lives in the shadow of those cooling towers. And when guest characters arrive from outside Springfield, when celebrities appear in the show drawn with different visual conventions, with more naturalistic proportions and more normally shaped eyes and features that more closely resemble standard human anatomy, the show has always explained this as a matter of artistic style. The Simpsons art style. Just how the show looks. Nothing to think about. But within the internal logic of the show's universe, within the world where Blinky exists and the water tests positive for contamination, and the safety inspector has been asleep at his console for 30 years, there is a visible, observable difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who arrive from outside it. The people inside look mutated. The people outside look normal. The animals confirm it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. Blinky has 3 eyes. The luminous rats glow. The wildlife in Springfield is demonstrably altered by the plant's runoff. The show tells you this directly, shows it to you with a 3-eyed fish on a fishing line, and then expects you to believe that the same contamination has had 0 effect on the humans who have been bathing in the same river water for generations. It has not had 0 effect. It has had every effect. The whole town is Blinky. The whole town is a 3-eyed fish. The mutations are just distributed differently across biology that is more complex and more capable of absorbing the changes without making them immediately visible. The yellow skin is not a stylistic choice. The 4 fingers are not an animation shortcut. They are what you get when you put a town of people next to a nuclear facility with 342 safety violations and leave them there for 50 years. Burns knows this. This is the part that moves the story from tragedy into something darker. Burns is not ignorant of what his plant is doing to Springfield. He is not operating under the assumption that the violations are harmless. He understands radiation. He understands it personally, intimately, at the level of his own body chemistry, because he himself requires weekly radiation treatments to sustain his biological function. He is the world's foremost expert on what radiation does to human tissue because he is living proof of it, managing its effects inside his own body with the precision of a man who cannot afford to be wrong. Burns knows that the plant is poisoning Springfield. He knows what that poisoning looks like over time. And he has made a calculation, a cold, deliberate, and presumably quite comfortable calculation, that the benefits of continued operation outweigh the costs. The costs being borne entirely by the residents of Springfield, who were not consulted and are not compensated, and are, for reasons we will explore in detail later, structurally incapable of fully understanding what is being done to them. That calculation is the through line of everything Burns does. It is not cruelty in the operatic sense. It is not the twirling mustache, the dramatic monologue, the pleasure of causing harm. It is the quieter and, in its own way, more horrifying thing. The simple arithmetic of a man who has placed his own interests so completely above the interests of everyone around him that he stopped seeing them as interests at all. They are variables in his calculation, factors to be managed, not people. The plant is the clearest expression of this. It is the clearest answer to the question that the show has been circling for 36 years without ever quite asking directly. What kind of person could do this, could maintain a facility in this condition for this long, with this degree of documented harm, and feel nothing? Could watch a fish pulled from a river with a 3rd eye and calculate the best political response without once wondering what that same water has done to the children growing up on its banks? The kind of person who built this plant, the kind of person who chose this town because it was small enough to own, the kind of person whose idea of a teddy bear named Bobo as the last soft thing in his life tells you everything you need to know about how completely the capacity for ordinary feeling was removed from him, or perhaps was never fully developed to begin with. And Springfield pays for it. Springfield has always paid for it. In its water, in its air, in the specific texture of its collective biology, the 4 fingers and the yellow skin and the overbites and the eyes that bulge slightly further than they should. In the compromised neurological function that makes the town's population so beautifully, so conveniently, so thoroughly incapable of looking up at those cooling towers and understanding what they are looking at. The plant is the crime. Everything else is a consequence. Section 3. the biological weapons lab, and the mother he destroyed. There is a crime in the history of Burns and Springfield that predates the plant's worst violations, that predates the three-eyed fish and the contaminated water and the playground waste dumps, that stretches back to 1969 and involves a woman most viewers of The Simpsons only ever knew as a ghost story. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother. The woman Abe Simpson told Homer was dead. She was not dead. She was hiding. She had been hiding for 27 years by the time the show finally reveals her in season 7. And the reason she was hiding, the reason she had to abandon her husband and her young son and vanish into a life of permanent, exhausting, fugitive existence, is Charles Montgomery Burns. But before we get to what Burns did to Mona, we have to talk about what Mona discovered about Burns. Because the revelation that Burns ruined Mona's family, as devastating as it is, sits on top of a more fundamental revelation. Burns was not only running a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations, he was also, simultaneously, running a biological weapons laboratory in Springfield, in the same town where Homer was growing up, in the same community where Mona was raising her family, doing her grocery shopping, living what appeared to be an ordinary domestic life in 1969, while the richest man in town was, a few miles away, manufacturing weaponized pathogens. The show presents this with characteristic tonal lightness. Mona and a group of activist hippies, outraged by Burns's germ warfare research, break into the facility. They destroy the biological agent stored inside with what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb. The bomb accidentally cures the asthma of the security guard on duty, who happens to be a young Clancy Wiggum. There is a warmth to the storytelling, a nostalgic softness in the flashback aesthetic, and the humor of the Wiggum detail gives the audience permission to feel good about what Mona is doing. But let us pause on the biology weapons facility itself, because the show moves past it very quickly, and the detail deserves to sit in the room for a moment. Burns owned a laboratory that produced biological weapons. In Springfield, he was not a government contractor. He was not operating under some classified federal program, at least not one the show establishes. He was a private citizen with a private fortune running a private germ warfare operation in a residential community. The laboratory was producing military-grade pathogens, diseases engineered to kill, being manufactured within driving distance of schools and parks, and the house where a young Homer Simpson was growing up, completely unaware, eating whatever was in the refrigerator and watching television, and having no idea that the air he was breathing shared a zip code with weaponized microorganisms. This is not a metaphor. This is not satire being pushed to an extreme for comedic effect. Within the show's established canon, Burns ran a biological weapons lab. He chose Springfield for it for the same reason he chose Springfield for the nuclear plant. The town was small enough to control, isolated enough to avoid scrutiny, and economically dependent enough that the kind of civic resistance that might challenge a billionaire's extracurricular germ warfare hobby simply did not exist there. Mona's group destroyed the facility. They broke in, they set off their antibiotic bomb, they dismantled what Burns had built. And on the way out, Mona made the mistake that would define the rest of her life. Someone was knocked down in the chaos of the raid. She stopped to help them. She stopped to help someone up off the ground, in the middle of an activist raid on a biological weapons facility, because that is the kind of person Mona Simpson was. She could not leave without making sure everyone was all right. The person she stopped to help was Burns himself. He saw her face. He identified her. He called the authorities. And Mona Simpson became a federal fugitive. Think about what that means in terms of the relationship between Burns's crimes and Mona's. Burns was manufacturing biological weapons in a residential community. Mona destroyed those weapons. By any reasonable moral calculus, Burns was the criminal and Mona was performing a public service. But Burns has the kind of wealth that transforms moral calculus into whatever math he needs it to be. He called the FBI. The FBI came. Mona ran. She ran and kept running for 27 years. She could not go home. She could not call Abe to explain. She could not hold her son or watch him grow up or be present for any of the 10,000 ordinary and extraordinary moments that constitute a childhood. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, one night in 1969, and she did not come back. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, showed him a grave, not Mona's grave, the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. For Homer's entire childhood, adolescence, and adult life up until he was in his mid-30s, he believed his mother had died when he was young. He grew up with that wound. The specific, particular wound of a child who lost their mother, who never got an explanation, who never had the chance to process the loss or understand it, or ask the questions that might have helped him carry it. He simply woke up one day and she was gone, and then he was told she was dead, and then he had to go on being a person with that knowledge installed in him like a weight he could not put down. His desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his clinging attachment to Marge that expresses itself as something between devotion and dependency, his willingness to endure humiliation from Burns day after day after day without ever developing the self-respect to resist it, his compulsive need to be liked, to be included, to be part of something, to belong, even in the most degrading and unsuitable circumstances, all of it. Every aspect of Homer's personality that you might chalk up to laziness or stupidity or cartoon character construction is, at its root, the behavior of a man who was motherless at 6 years old and never recovered. Burns did not cause Homer's grief directly. He was not in the room the night Mona left, but he set the conditions for it. He was the reason she had to leave. He was the reason she could not come back. And he was the reason that for 27 years, a little boy who became a young man, who became a middle-aged man, carried a wound that had no name because the wound's origin had been hidden from him. When the show finally brings Mona back in season 7, the reunion is exactly as emotionally devastating as it should be. Homer finds her at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave because she read in a newspaper that Homer had died, a misunderstanding stemming from Homer's characteristically chaotic life. They find each other. They have, briefly, the reunion that 27 years of absence made impossible. A grown man and his mother, catching up on the years that were stolen from them, standing beside a headstone that belongs to a poet named Walt Whitman in a cemetery in a town that Burns still controls. And then Burns sees her through a taxi window. He recognizes her because Burns remembers everything about the people who have wronged him, keeps the grudge alive and perfectly preserved across decades the way he keeps himself alive, through the application of sufficient resources and the total absence of forgiveness. He makes a call. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, this time understanding why she is leaving, understanding who is forcing her out, understanding that the man responsible is the man whose name appears on his paychecks. And Homer does not quit. He does not confront Burns. He does not do any of the things that a person who has just connected these dots should do. He says goodbye to his mother and goes back to work. This is the moment that reveals the deepest and most terrible dimension of what Burns has done to Homer. It is not just that Burns destroyed Homer's family. It is that he destroyed Homer's capacity to respond to that destruction. The cognitive impairment, the radiation exposure, the crayon in the brain, the decades of living in a contaminated environment. All of it has produced a man who can hold two pieces of information simultaneously. My mother was driven away by this man, and I work for this man, and simply be unable to connect them into an action. The damage is too deep. The wiring is too compromised. The part of Homer's brain that might, in a healthy person, produce outrage and resistance, produces instead a kind of blankness, a shrug, a donut. Burns did not just take Mona from Homer. He took Homer's ability to understand that he was taken from. When Mona Simpson dies, in a later season, in one of the show's most genuinely quiet and painful episodes, Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand, he watches her go. There are no gags, no reset, just a man and his mother and the weight of everything that was stolen, from both of them pressing down so heavily that the show, for once, does not try to lift it. She died still a fugitive. She died with the FBI still notionally interested in a woman who, 50 years earlier, destroyed a biological weapons facility. She died with the knowledge that her son had grown up believing she abandoned him. She died with Burns still alive, still in possession of his empire, still the richest and most powerful man in the town she had tried, once, to make safer. He outlived her. Of course he did. And Homer went back to work on Monday. The biological weapons laboratory is important for another reason beyond its direct effect on Mona and Homer. It establishes a dimension of Burns's operation that the nuclear plant alone cannot fully explain. The plant is visible. The cooling towers break the Springfield skyline and everyone can see them. The contamination is everywhere, and everyone absorbs it, even if nobody names it. But the biological weapons lab was hidden. It was secret. It existed in a facility that was not on any public document, in a location that the community did not know about, producing things that the community did not know existed. Burns is not only willing to cause harm, he is willing to cause harm in secret. He is willing to manufacture danger and store it in close proximity to civilian populations without their knowledge or consent. The nuclear plant at least provides electricity. It at least creates the fiction of a transaction. Springfield gets power, Burns gets money, the harm is a side effect, terrible and deliberate but structurally deniable. The biological weapons lab provided Springfield with nothing. It was not a community asset. It was not an employer or an infrastructure provider. It was a private project operating in a shared community space, a space that contained children and families and ordinary people going about their lives, and it was dangerous in a way that made the nuclear plant's contamination look almost incidental. This is what Burns actually is, stripped of all the tonal lightness and the comedic framing and the cartoon conventions. He is a man who will build a germ warfare facility in a residential neighborhood and then use his resources to destroy the life of the woman who tried to stop him. He is a man who will watch a child grow up motherless and, 30 years later, recognize that child's mother through a taxi window and make the call that sends her running again. He is a man who has never once, in any episode, in any scene, in any line of dialogue, expressed anything resembling remorse for what he did to Mona Simpson and the family she was forced to leave behind. He did not see her as a person he had wronged. He saw her as someone who had crossed him. And in Burns's moral universe, those are the same category. Being wronged and being crossed. They are both infractions. They both require response. The fact that his response to being wronged was to destroy a family, and the fact that her crossing of him was destroying a biological weapons lab, those asymmetries do not register for Burns. Because he does not perform moral arithmetic the way most people do. He performs arithmetic, quantities, balances, what was taken from him and what can be recovered. The antibiotic bomb took something from Burns, so he took something from Mona. And the something he took from Mona was her life, her actual life. Not her existence, though he tried for that too, but the life she had built and was building, the marriage, the child, the ordinary domestic existence that she had been living alongside her activism, keeping both things alive, being both a mother and a person with principles. He took all of it, with one phone call, and then he went back to work on Monday. Section 4, the employee he chose. By the time Burns and Springfield entered the 1990s, the relationship between the world's oldest billionaire and his most famously incompetent employee had been running for long enough to look, from a certain distance, like simple inertia. Homer Simpson had been working at the plant for years. Burns could never remember his name. Homer kept causing incidents, surviving near misses, appearing on the wrong side of every regulatory interaction with the facility, and somehow remaining employed through all of it. The casual explanation was always that Burns just did not pay enough attention to what happened in Sector 7G to notice or care about the man working there. The casual explanation is wrong. Homer Simpson's continued employment at the Springfield nuclear power plant is not an accident. It is not negligence. It is not the result of Burns's general indifference to the people below him in the organizational hierarchy. It is the result of a deal. A specific, deliberate contractual agreement between Burns and Abraham Simpson that guaranteed Homer employment at the plant regardless of his performance, regardless of his violations, regardless of the documented evidence that his continued presence in the safety inspector role was an active danger to everyone in the facility and, by extension, to everyone in Springfield. The deal was brokered because Burns had committed a crime that Abe discovered. The show reveals this in the kind of passing, almost throwaway moment that it uses to bury its most significant plot information, a technique so practiced and so consistent that it almost feels deliberate. A way of giving the audience everything they need to understand the full architecture of Springfield's corruption while maintaining enough narrative momentum that the implications do not fully land until you are lying awake at 2 in the morning trying to remember what episode you heard. Something in. Burns committed a crime. Abe found out about it, and instead of doing anything about the crime, Abe made a deal. He accepted Burns's offer. His son would have a job. A permanent, protected, inviolable job at the plant, regardless of competence, regardless of performance, regardless of the 742 documented errors that would eventually accumulate on Homer's record. In exchange, Abe's silence was guaranteed. 3 generations of Simpsons, bent into the shape Burns required. But the deal, as significant as it is not actually the most interesting part of the Homer employment story. The most interesting part is what Homer's presence at the plant actually does for Burns, because it does something very specific and very useful that a competent safety inspector never would. When German investors briefly purchased the Springfield nuclear power plant, they did something that no owner in the facility's history had done before. They fired Homer Simpson on day one. The very first thing. They looked at the safety inspector position, looked at the man occupying it, and made the obvious, rational, and professionally responsible decision that this particular individual should not be performing this particular function in this particular facility. And then they looked at the cost of bringing the plant into compliance. They looked at the estimate for addressing those 342 violations and actually engaging with what would be required to operate the facility at a legal standard. And the number they were given nearly bankrupted them. Not because the number was fraudulent, because it was accurate. The actual cost of making this plant safe was so enormous, so reflective of how far outside legal operating parameters the facility had drifted, that no owner who was not already in Burns's specific financial position could absorb it. Burns bought the plant back, immediately, and the first thing he did was rehire Homer. Read that sequence carefully. A competent replacement for Homer was brought in. The plant was assessed for actual compliance. The compliance cost was calculated. Burns reacquired the plant at the moment when that cost became apparent, and then he reinstated Homer. Homer is not at the plant despite the violations. Homer is at the plant because of the violations. A safety inspector who does his job would shut the plant down within the first week of honest assessment. He would find the 342 problems. He would find the skeletons in the basement. He would find the luminous rats and the chewing gum-patched cooling towers and the plutonium paperweight, and he would fill out the forms and make the calls and begin the process that ends with the facility being closed and Burns being forced to explain, on the record and under oath, what has been happening in there and what it has done to the town surrounding it. Homer never does any of that, not because he is lazy, though he is, not because he is unintelligent, though he has been rendered so by a combination of environmental contamination and physical brain damage, but because his presence in the safety inspector role is functionally identical to the absence of a safety inspector. He is the human equivalent of an unlocked filing cabinet. He creates the bureaucratic appearance of oversight while providing none of the actual function. Burns needs that gap. He needs the space between the appearance of compliance and the reality of it. He needs a safety inspector who will sleep at his console during meltdown warnings, who will eat donuts during emergency procedures, who will once throw a donut into an active reactor core to see what happens, and who will then not report any of it in any form that could create a documented record of what actually occurs in the day-to-day operation of this facility. Homer is not Burns's safety inspector. He is Burns's immunity. His presence in the role makes the role meaningless, and a meaningless safety inspector at a nuclear power plant is, from Burns's perspective, an ideal arrangement. Better than no safety inspector, because no safety inspector would attract attention. A safety inspector who simply fails to do his job is invisible. He creates the paperwork. He occupies the chair. He provides the organizational chart with a name in the relevant box. And he never, not once, not in 3 decades of documented employment, does anything that threatens the continued operation of the facility in its current illegal and dangerous and profitable condition. There is a depth to the cynicism here that the show does not always foreground, but always rewards if you look for it. Burns did not hire Homer because Homer was available and the position needed filling. He hired Homer, kept Homer, protected Homer through a contractual arrangement with Homer's own father, and rehired Homer after the one period of his absence, specifically because Homer is the most useful form of safety inspector Burns could possibly have. Someone who looks like oversight and functions like a door held open. And the deal with Abe adds another layer of corruption to the whole structure. Because Abe did not make this deal out of desperation or poverty or the kind of impossible circumstance that might at least explain a choice without excusing it, Abe made the deal in full knowledge of what it meant. He watched Burns commit a crime. He had evidence. He had, in that moment, genuine leverage over the most powerful man in Springfield, leverage he could have used to do any number of things. He could have taken it to the authorities. He could have demanded real accountability. He could have used his position to extract something meaningful for the town. Some remediation of the plant's violations, some safety commitment, some protection for the community that was already absorbing the consequences of Burns's choices. He traded all of that for his son's job security. Homer never knew about the deal. He still does not know. He works at the plant, has worked at the plant his entire adult life, believing on some level that he is there because he qualified for the position and has managed to keep it through some combination of luck and the general low standards of his employer. He does not know that his father sold his future, his grandfather's silence, and the town's safety for the guarantee that Homer Simpson would always have a role to fill in Sector 7G. He does not know that his employment is not the result of anything he did or is. It is the contractual remnant of a crime and a bargain made before he was old enough to have a say in it. He is at that plant because Burns needed him there, and because Abe needed the guarantee, and because between the two of them, they had everything they needed to construct the arrangement without consulting the person most directly affected by it. Homer Simpson, the human being at the center of the story. The man whose mother was driven out, whose father made a deal with her persecutor, whose cognitive function has been eroded by decades of proximity to the facility whose violations he was hired to ignore. He is the most thoroughly victimized character in The Simpsons, and the most thoroughly victimized in the specific way Burns victimizes people, not through direct violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the patient, structural management of circumstances, until the person inside them has no room left to move in any direction except the one Burns needs them to move in. The 742 documented errors on Homer's employment record are not evidence of Burns's tolerance or his inattention. They are evidence of the deal. Every error that should have produced a firing and did not is a data point in the contractual obligation that Abe created. Burns did not keep Homer on despite those errors. He kept Homer on because of the arrangement those errors document. Each unchallenged violation of professional conduct is Burns fulfilling his end of the bargain. Each survival of an incident that should have ended Homer's employment is the deal still holding, the original crime still buried, the silence still maintained. And the silence covers everything. It covers the biological weapons lab. It covers whatever crime Burns committed that Abe discovered. It covers the violations at the plant. It covers the real reason Homer's mother had to leave. It covers the entire architecture of Burns's relationship with the Simpson family across 3 generations, a relationship that has never been about employment or community or even the specific malice of personal grudge. It has been about the kind of control that works by eliminating options, by making Burns the most stable element in every equation, by ensuring that the people around him are always more dependent on him than he is on them. Homer is dependent on Burns for his paycheck. He is also dependent on Burns for the deal that protects that paycheck. He is also dependent on Burns in the neurological sense, his cognitive function having been compromised by the plant's environmental output over 30 years of daily exposure. He is also dependent on Burns in the sense that his entire psychological identity, the desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the clinging attachment to stability, was shaped by the loss of his mother, a loss that Burns engineered. Burns has never loved Homer Simpson. He has barely acknowledged his existence. He calls him by the wrong name with such consistency that it became a running joke in the early seasons. But Burns has needed Homer, in the specific functional way that a machine needs a particular component. Homer is the component that keeps the plant running by preventing real oversight. Burns is the system that keeps Homer employed by honoring a deal made with a man who is probably not even alive to remember it. And Springfield is the community that absorbs the output of this arrangement in its water and its air and its biology, without ever fully understanding the exchange that is taking place. Homer chose to put the crayon back in his brain. That is the moment the show uses to seal this particular tragedy. When the crayon is removed, when Homer's intelligence is briefly restored, he sees Springfield clearly. He sees his job for what it is. He sees the plant for what it is. He sees the relationship between Burns and his family for what it is. He writes a detailed, lucid analysis of what the plant has been doing to the community. He tries to submit it through proper channels. He attempts, for the first time in his life, to actually perform the function he has been nominally assigned to perform for decades. Nobody listens. The analysis is ignored. The channels are closed. The proper procedures lead nowhere. Because the proper procedures in Springfield, as in every institution Burns has touched, are not oriented toward the public interest. They are oriented toward the preservation of the existing arrangement. And the existing arrangement requires Homer to be the kind of safety inspector who cannot write a lucid analysis of what the plant is doing to the community. So, Homer has the crayon put back in. He chooses the fog over the clarity. He chooses not knowing over the unbearable knowledge of what he knows and cannot change. And this is where Homer's tragedy and Burns's design converge most completely. Burns did not force Homer to put the crayon back. He did not need to. He had already built a Springfield so thoroughly arranged around his interests, so effectively closed off to any challenge to the existing order, that a briefly intelligent Homer had no practical option other than to make himself stupid again. The choice was not free. It was the last door in a corridor where Burns had closed all the others. Homer goes back to work on Monday. The crayon goes back in. The plant keeps running. The violations stay uncorrected. The water stays contaminated. The fish in the river grow their third eyes, and Charles Montgomery Burns sits in his office at the top of the power plant with his fingers steepled and his memories intact and his weekly radiation treatments scheduled and his immortality carefully managed, looking down at Springfield through a window that has never been cleaned, knowing exactly what he has built and exactly what it is doing and feeling. As far as any evidence suggests, absolutely nothing about it at all. Section 5. The Sunblocker. There is a moment in the story of Burns and Springfield that stands apart from all the others. Not because it is the most harmful thing Burns has done, because in terms of cumulative biological damage, the plant's 36-year contamination of the town's water supply almost certainly outpaces it. Not because it is the most personal, because the destruction of Mona Simpson's life and family carries a specific intimacy that the sun-blocking scheme does not. It stands apart because it is the moment when Burns stopped being subtle. Everything before it was deniable. The plant violations were regulatory failures. The biological weapons lab was a secret. The deal with Abe was private. The contamination of the water supply was a side effect, officially, of operations that had at least the formal structure of a legitimate business. Burns had always maintained, across everything he did, a distance between himself and the direct articulation of his intentions. He operated through systems, through arrangements, through the accumulated structural weight of his wealth and his institutional reach. He had never, before this, simply said out loud that he intended to dominate Springfield completely and make its survival contingent on his goodwill. The sunblocking scheme was Burns saying that out loud. The premise was straightforward. Burns needed a way to force Springfield's population to consume electricity from his plant exclusively. Not because there were meaningful competitors threatening his market position. Not because some emerging technology was displacing the plant's role in the town's infrastructure, but because Burns had conceived, in the specific way that a man with unlimited resources and a bored contempt for human dignity conceives of things, that total dependence was more satisfying than partial dependence. And total dependence required making electricity from any other source impossible. So he built a machine, a giant mechanical disk, large enough to block the sun over Springfield. If the sun is blocked, solar energy is impossible. If the sun is blocked, growing food becomes difficult. If the sun is blocked, the basic biological rhythms that sustain life in any community dependent on agriculture and natural light are disrupted. Burns was not proposing to inconvenience Springfield. He was proposing to make the sun unavailable to it, to make survival without his plant's output not just economically challenging, but physically threatening. And he did it. He actually did it. He built the machine, he positioned it, he blocked the sun. Springfield went dark. This is the act, more than any other in 36 seasons, that strips away every possible deniability from Burns's relationship with the town. The plant could be an accident. The violations could be negligence. The contamination could be the regrettable side effect of an otherwise legitimate industrial operation. But this There is no way to position blocking out the sun as anything other than what it is. It is domination. Explicit, undeniable, theatrical domination. It is Burns deciding that the pretense of being a businessman providing a community service was no longer necessary. He wanted Springfield to know that their electricity, their light, their survival belonged to him. He wanted the town to look up at the sky and understand the arrangement in terms that could not be mistaken. It says something significant about Burns's psychology that he reached for this particular form of control. A more pragmatic villain would have found a subtler way to corner the energy market. You do not need to block out the sun to prevent competitors from emerging. Regulatory capture, political lobbying, strategic price cutting would accomplish the same economic goal without requiring you to build a machine that functions, in its simplest description, as a mechanism for stealing daylight from an entire community. Burns did not choose this approach because it was strategically optimal. He chose it because it was total. Because there is something in Burns's nature that is not satisfied by practical dominance. He needs dominance to be visible. He needs the people he controls to know that they are controlled and to know that the source of their subjection is him. The sun-blocking machine is not a business decision. It is a statement. A very old man with a very old grudge against the concept of human autonomy, expressing himself in the only language he truly understands. The language of power made unmistakable. What makes this episode structurally fascinating, beyond the audacity of the scheme itself, is how it handles the town's response. Springfield is angry, genuinely, collectively, meaningfully angry. For once, the diffuse resentments and individual grievances that various residents carry have been crystallized into a single, visible, undeniable injustice. Burns has taken the sun. Everyone can see that the sun is gone. Nobody can explain it away as a side effect or a coincidence or a regulatory matter that is too complex for most people to understand. The sun is gone. Burns took it. The town gathers. The weapons come out. The energy in the town meeting scene in Who Shot Mr.? Burns is the most political the show ever becomes. This is an entire community at the end of its rope. These are people who have, across years of episodes, absorbed violation after violation, contamination after contamination, humiliation after humiliation, and have always ultimately retreated back into the comfortable numbness of accepting that this is how things are in Springfield. This time they cannot retreat. The evidence is literally overhead. The consequence is immediate and universal. The harm is not a three-eyed fish in a river, which you can avoid looking at. The harm is the absence of the sun, which you cannot escape no matter where you stand in Springfield. And Burns is shot. We will deal with the question of who pulled the trigger in a separate discussion. For now, what matters is the context. Burns was shot because a town finally reached the limit of what it could absorb. Because the accumulated weight of everything he had done, the contamination, the violations, the stolen oil well from Springfield Elementary, the destruction of the retirement home, the injury to the Simpson family dog, the firing of Smithers, and the blocking of the sun, finally reached a mass that no amount of collective denial could hold back. And then Burns woke up from his coma, survived the shooting as he has survived everything else, and Springfield went back to normal. The sun-blocking machine was presumably removed. The immediate crisis passed. Burns eventually resumed his position at the plant. The violations remained. The contamination continued. The three-eyed fish swam in their river. But something about that episode, about the sheer scale of what Burns attempted, deserves to be held in the mind longer than the show's narrative structure allows. He tried to take the sun, not metaphorically, not as an expression of his general monopolizing tendencies. He built a machine and he used it to take the sun away from an entire town. That town's children woke up one morning and the sky was dark, and the reason it was dark was that the man who owned the power plant had decided he wanted more. The school that lost its funding. The oil well that Burns drilled beneath Springfield Elementary, collapsing the school's budget in the process. This is another dimension of the sun-blocking episode's context. Burns did not only attack the town's adult population, he went after the school. He extracted oil from beneath a building full of children because there was oil there and he wanted it. Not because the school could meaningfully resist him. Not because the extraction was part of some larger strategic plan. Because the resource was available, and Burns's operating principle is that available resources belong to whoever is willing to claim them most aggressively. The school lost its music program. Tito Puente lost his job. Lisa Simpson, who the show consistently frames as the most morally serious and intellectually gifted member of the Simpson family, lost access to the educational enrichment that the oil revenue had been funding. Not as a side effect, the school's financial collapse was a direct consequence of Burns drilling beneath it. He knew the school was there. He knew what the financial disruption would do. He did it anyway because the oil was worth more to him than the school's budget was to him. That is the sun-blocking episode's full context. The act that finally pushed Springfield's population to violence was not an isolated moment of Burns' overreaching. It was the culmination of a sustained campaign against every institution in Springfield that had anything to offer him. The oil beneath the school, the land beneath the retirement home, the building that housed Moe's Tavern, the union that represented the workers in his plant, the sunlight over the entire town. Burns worked through the list with the patience of someone who has had a very long time to plan and feels no particular urgency because the people being harmed are not, in any meaningful sense, people to him. Smithers tried to stop him. This is worth noting. Smithers, who has dedicated his entire adult life to the service of Burns and whose devotion represents one of the show's most complex and most quietly heartbreaking ongoing subplots, drew a line. He told Burns that blocking the sun was too far, that it would cause genuine suffering for the people of Springfield, that it was wrong in terms that were direct and unambiguous and that Burns clearly understood. Burns fired him on the spot. Not because Smithers was wrong, not because Burns had a counter-argument, but because Burns does not permit people in his employ to express limits. Limits are an assertion of perspective, and perspective in Burns's environment is something that belongs exclusively to Burns. The moment Smithers said this is too far, he was no longer the perfectly calibrated instrument Burns needed him to be. He had become a person with an opinion. Burns does not require persons with opinions. He requires people who execute decisions. And a person who will tell him no even once, even on the question of whether to steal the sun, is a person who might tell him no again on something he is not prepared to negotiate. Smithers was retired. Burns blocked the sun, and then Burns was shot. The symmetry is almost elegant. The only person in Burns's life who might have prevented the worst of what Burns does was removed at the exact moment his intervention would have mattered most. Smithers gone, Burns unrestrained, the machine deployed, the sun disappeared, and a town full of people at the end of their patience gathered in a meeting hall with weapons. One bullet. Burns on the sundial. The hands pointing to letters that may or may not mean anything. And then, eventually, everything went back to the way it was. Because in Springfield, it always does. The sun-blocking scheme is Burns at his most legible. No deniability, no subtlety, no pretense of legitimate business. Just a very old man building a machine to take the sun away from a town he has been slowly poisoning for decades, because complete dominance is the only state he can imagine as satisfying. The three-eyed fish is an environmental side effect. The school's oil well is a resource extraction. The retirement home's collapse is a structural consequence of land value decisions. The biological weapons lab was a private enterprise conducted in secret. All of those could be argued, in the most charitable possible reading, as the accumulation of damage rather than its direct intent. The sun machine is intent. Pure, undiluted, architecturally expressed intent. Burns wanted Springfield in the dark. Burns built the machine that would put Springfield in the dark. Burns operated the machine. Springfield went into the dark. There is no version of that story in which Burns is not the villain. Not the difficult businessman, not the out-of-touch billionaire, not the eccentric old man who has outlived every contemporary social norm. The villain. The person who looked at a town full of people and decided that daylight was a negotiating chip. Section 6. The Immortal Billionaire. Charles Montgomery Burns has been alive since the late 1800s. The show's continuity on this point is, by its own standards, remarkably consistent. He has personal memories of events that occurred before the 20th century. He has told first-hand stories about interactions with historical figures who died before most of the show's current audience was born. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during World War II, a capacity that was, by the show's own description, morally questionable. He knew Howard Hughes. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history but as lived experience. By the most conservative accounting of the evidence, Burns is well over 100 years old. By certain readings of the show's continuity, he could be pushing 140. He is, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere between the oldest known person in American history and a figure whose longevity has no real-world equivalent outside of mythology. He does not merely exist at this age, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with sufficient strategic intelligence to have maintained and grown it for decades. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates multi-episode schemes that require sustained planning, adaptation, and the ability to project consequences across complex systems. His body is frail. His physical strength is essentially non-existent. Burns is famously threatened by a single bee, a single piece of regular mail, a gentle breeze. His skeleton is visible through his skin in certain episodes. He moves through the world with the physical presence of a dried leaf, but his mind is the sharpest instrument in Springfield. Burns is, arguably, the most strategically intelligent character in the show's universe. He is not wise in any compassionate sense. He is not thoughtful in any way that benefits anyone other than himself. But he is extraordinarily good at reading power structures, identifying leverage, predicting how people will behave when their circumstances are arranged in particular ways, and engineering arrangements that produce the outcomes he wants. He has been doing this for over a century. He is very, very good at it. The question is how. The show addresses this directly. In the Springfield Files episode, Burns undergoes a weekly medical regimen, a treatment so extreme, so loaded with experimental chemicals and controlled radiation exposure that the process causes his body to emit a visible green glow. After each treatment, Burns wanders out of the facility in a dazed, post-procedural state, stumbling through the woods near Springfield, illuminated by his own body chemistry. When Homer sees this glowing figure moving through the darkness, his first instinct is alien. That is how far outside the normal register of human experience Burns's post-treatment state appears. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 week. Without it, Burns dies. This is not hyperbole or narrative embellishment. The show states it plainly. The margin for error in Burns's survival is 7 days. Miss one appointment, and the system fails. His life is sustained not through any natural biological process, but through the scheduled application of a medical protocol, so demanding that it requires dedicated infrastructure to maintain. Think about what this means structurally. Burns is not simply an old man with good doctors. Burns is a biological system in a state of permanent managed crisis. His body has been so fundamentally altered by over a century of proximity to nuclear material, so thoroughly penetrated by radiation exposure that it can no longer sustain its own function without external intervention, that he requires the equivalent of weekly servicing, like a machine, like a reactor, like the power plant he owns, which also requires constant maintenance and adjustment to prevent the kind of catastrophic failure that the word meltdown describes. Burns is his own power plant. He runs on radiation. He requires controlled inputs to maintain operational stability. And if the maintenance schedule slips, if the treatments are interrupted, the consequence is not a gradual decline or a slow deterioration. The consequence is immediate systemic shutdown. This explains the Three Stooges syndrome. In one of the show's most quoted medical scenes, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he carries every disease known to medical science, every single one, simultaneously present in his body, but arranged in a state of perfect equilibrium where each condition cancels out the others. Three Stooges, the doctor says. 3 people trying to get through a door at once, none of them able to get through, the gridlock being what keeps Burns technically alive despite being technically the sickest person in the United States. The conventional reading is that this is a gag about Burns's age and his accumulated health disasters. But under the radiation theory, it is something more coherent and more horrifying. Burns is not accidentally in this state of biological equilibrium. The weekly treatments put him there and keep him there. They do not cure his diseases. They manage them. They adjust the balance, apply the right inputs, maintain the equilibrium that prevents any single condition from breaking through and killing him. Every week, Smithers ensures Burns makes his appointment. Every week, the treatment is administered. Every week, the balance is recalibrated, and Burns survives another 7 days. The treatment involves radiation. It must, given that Burns's body has been adapted to it over a century of exposure. What kept him alive through the early decades of his relationship with nuclear material has, over time, become the thing that sustains him. He is past the point where normal medicine applies. He is a biological system that has been running on a non-standard fuel for so long that the standard fuel, ordinary nutrition and rest, and the natural processes of cellular maintenance is no longer sufficient. He needs radiation the way a normal human needs food, not metaphorically, metabolically. And Smithers knows all of this. Smithers has spent his career in the service of Burns, and the texture of that service is different from any other employer-employee relationship in the show. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures the appointments are kept. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with an attention that borders on medical supervision. Smithers is the only person who fully understands the protocol that keeps Burns alive, the only person who knows which treatments, which timing, which dosages, which sequence of interventions corresponds to another week of functional existence for a man who should, by every biological measure, have died before the Second World War. The show frames Smithers's devotion as love, and there is love in it, a complex, melancholy, unrequited love that the show handles with more care and more genuine feeling than almost any other relationship in its long history. But underneath the love, there is something more practical and more frightening. Smithers knows that his absence is a death sentence. He does not merely feel this emotionally, he knows it logically. If Smithers leaves, if he is fired, if something happens to him, if he takes a vacation without arranging coverage, Burns misses a treatment. The equilibrium collapses. The diseases surge. Burns dies. That knowledge is the foundation of the relationship. Not just Smithers' love for Burns, but Burns' structural dependency on Smithers. Burns would never articulate this. Burns does not articulate need. Burns does not acknowledge that anything outside himself is necessary to his continued existence, because acknowledging need is, in Burns' moral universe, a form of weakness. But the arrangement speaks for itself. Smithers is not dispensable. Smithers is the keystone. Remove him, and the entire structure of Burns' continued existence begins to fall. This is why the firing of Smithers in the sun-blocking episode is so remarkable. Burns fired the one person who is irreplaceable to his actual survival because Smithers disagreed with him. That is the depth of Burns' commitment to the principle that no one around him is permitted to have a perspective that limits his choices. He would rather risk his own death than permit his assistant to tell him no. Smithers came back. Of course he came back. Because Smithers always comes back. But the moment is revealing in a way Burns probably did not intend. He fired the person keeping him alive, rather than hear the word no. That is how much the maintenance of total authority costs Burns, and how completely he is willing to pay it. The immortality question has another dimension, one the show introduces through Burns' family history. The Burns dynasty extends back centuries. This is a family that has been in continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. Normal generational succession does not produce this kind of continuity. Families fragment. Fortunes dissipate. Heirs spend what their parents accumulated. The natural arc of inherited wealth is dispersal, not concentration. But the Burns family's wealth has not dispersed. If anything, it has grown. The current Burns has maintained and extended a fortune that was already ancient when he took control of it. And the implication, never stated directly but present in the architecture of everything the show tells you about the family, is that previous Burns patriarchs may have employed similar strategies. Before nuclear radiation, before the specific medical technology that currently sustains Burns, the family has always found ways to extend its hold on power beyond what normal biological limits should allow. What does that mean? The show does not say, but it invites the question of whether what Burns does for himself, the management of his own biological continuation through extraordinary means, represents a family tradition. Whether the Burns dynasty has always been in the business of cheating death, using whatever tools were available in their era, accumulating the kind of wealth that buys immunity to the limits that constrain everyone else. The scariest thing about Burns' immortality is not that he might be eternal. It is what his immortality means for Springfield, because Burns and the town are linked in a feedback loop. The town's economy depends on the plant. The plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on his treatments, His treatments depend on the infrastructure of his wealth. His wealth depends on the plant's continued operation and the town's continued dependency. Every element sustains every other element. Remove any single component, and the system begins to fail. Remove Burns, and the plant faces immediate questions of ownership, compliance, and liability that might finally force the conversation about what it has done to Springfield. Remove the plant, and the town's economy collapses. Remove Springfield's dependency on the plant, and Burns loses his leverage. The loop is closed. It has always been closed, and as long as Burns survives, the loop will continue to turn. Burns has spent a century building a system that is designed, above all else, to ensure his survival. Every politician he has purchased, every regulator he has neutralized, every institution he has compromised, every doctor he has retained, every Smithers he has kept in close proximity to manage the schedule. All of it serves the single ultimate purpose of keeping the reactor running, keeping Burns alive, keeping the treatments coming, keeping the system closed. He is the oldest man in Springfield. He might be the oldest man in America. He has outlived every person who ever knew the original version of him, the young man he was before a century of radiation exposure and cold calculation transformed him into something that requires weekly intervention to remain technically alive. He has outlived every regulator who might have shut him down, every political opponent who might have broken his hold on the town, every member of the community whose knowledge of his crimes would have been dangerous if they had lived long enough to find someone willing to listen. He has outlived them all, and he will probably outlive the next generation too, unless something breaks the loop, unless something disrupts the arrangement, unless someone, somewhere, finds a way to pull one thread loose from the fabric of what Burns has built and keeps pulling until the whole structure begins to unravel. The show has never provided that someone. The show, in its way, cannot provide that someone, because the show is also caught in a loop. A loop that requires Burns to remain at the top of Springfield's hierarchy, aging without aging, glowing softly from his weekly treatments, peering down at the town through his office window, plotting the next scheme with fingers steepled and eyes gleaming and a mind that has been calculating the arithmetic of human suffering for over 100 years and has never, not once, come up with a number that gave him pause. Section 7. The Web of Control. A corrupt billionaire who owns a nuclear power plant and controls a town's electricity supply is, by itself, a comprehensible kind of villain. There are real-world analogs. Industrial monopolists who capture their local economies. Energy companies that use regulatory leverage to prevent competition. The specific structure of Burns's dominance over Springfield's economic life, while unusually complete, is recognizable as an extreme version of something that actually happens in the world. What makes Burns different? What makes his relationship with Springfield qualitatively distinct from the kind of industrial capture that characterizes even the worst corporate actors in the real world is the breadth of his institutional reach. Burns does not only own the power plant, he does not only control the electricity supply, he has extended his influence into every institution in Springfield that exercises meaningful power over people's lives. The government, the police, the media, the courts, the medical establishment, the educational system. Each of these is, to a varying degree, within the sphere of Burns's influence. Each of them represents a potential check on his behavior that has been transformed through the patient accumulation of favors and threats and financial relationships into the opposite of a check, into a mechanism that protects him. Start with the political class. Springfield has an elected mayor, Mayor Quimby, a figure of spectacular and unashamed corruption whose venality the show depicts with affectionate contempt. Quimby takes bribes. Quimby is connected to organized crime. Quimby would not recognize a genuine public interest if it handed him a campaign contribution. But within the specific landscape of Springfield politics, Quimby is not Burns's opponent. He is Burns's instrument. The relationship between them is never made fully explicit, but the show establishes it through the accumulation of episodes in which municipal policy consistently serves Burns's interests, in which the regulatory environment around the plant remains mysteriously permissive, in which the kind of political challenge that should be produced by documented environmental harm repeatedly fails to materialize or is neutralized before it gains real traction. Burns does not attend city council meetings. He does not need to. The people who attend city council meetings already know what he wants. The police situation is, in some ways, even more direct. Chief Clancy Wiggum is, within the Simpsons universe, the platonic ideal of institutional failure. He is incompetent in ways that range from negligent to actively harmful. He solves no crimes. He provides no meaningful public safety. He is corrupt, indolent, and deeply unsuited to the function his office is supposed to serve. And this is wonderful for Burns. A police department that functions, that investigates seriously, that follows evidence regardless of where it leads, that is capable of treating complaints about a billionaire's environmental crimes with the same seriousness it would bring to any other case, is a genuine institutional threat to everything Burns has built. A police department led by Clancy Wiggum is not that. There is also the matter of Wiggum's history with Burns. The show establishes, through the Mona Simpson backstory, that a young Clancy Wiggum was the security guard at Burns's biological weapons laboratory in 1969. He was there the night Mona and her group raided the facility. The antibiotic bomb accidentally cured his asthma. He survived the raid with his lungs clear and his memory of the facility intact. And then, he became Springfield's chief of police. The show presents this as a coincidence, as background detail, as the kind of connection that the show deposits in its mythology and does not return to, but the connection is there. The man responsible for law enforcement in Springfield spent part of his young career as security for a facility that Burns was running illegally. Whatever Wiggum knows or does not know about what that facility was doing, whatever he remembers or chooses not to remember about that night in 1969, he is permanently compromised by his proximity to it. Burns does not need to actively manage Wiggum. He simply needs Wiggum to remain in office, which requires ensuring that Wiggum's continued position is more valuable to him than any investigation of anything connected to Burns's operations. That is not a difficult arrangement to maintain. The legal system? Springfield's judiciary is represented primarily by Judge Snyder, whose most significant canonical action is the legal decree in The Principal and the Pauper episode that makes it a crime to refer to Armin Tamzarian by his real name. A judge who will issue a legal decree criminalizing truth on behalf of a town that wants to believe a comfortable lie is a judge who has a particular understanding of what the legal system is for. It is not for truth. It is not for justice in any meaningful sense. It is for the maintenance of arrangements that the powerful prefer. Burns is the most powerful person in Springfield. Judge Snyder is the judge in Springfield. The math of what that means for any legal proceeding involving Burns's interests is not complicated. There was the gubernatorial candidate who tried to make Blinky into a political issue. He had evidence. He had public attention. He had the kind of momentum that, in a functional political environment, might have forced genuine accountability. And then he ate the fish at a dinner party and the momentum collapsed. The show treats this as a story about public relations and media management. But there is a layer below that. Burns was invited to that dinner. Burns was able to position himself as a gracious host rather than a defendant. The candidate was placed in a situation where refusing to eat the fish would have looked petty, and Burns's willingness to serve it would look like confidence. The whole setup, the dinner, the fish, the press, the optics, did not arrange itself. Burns arranged it. That is political management. That is what it looks like when a man who has spent decades cultivating institutional relationships deploys them against a specific threat, not through force, not through overt intimidation, through the careful manipulation of context until the threatening situation resolves in his favor, the candidate loses, and the fish is back in the river where it was caught. The media environment in Springfield is represented primarily by Kent Brockman, who covers the Springfield beat with the specific breed of self-important, ratings-driven, editorially flexible journalism that the show uses to comment on the broader media landscape. Brockman is not Burns's employee. He does not receive a paycheck from the Burns family. But he operates in an environment where the most significant local story, the most significant ongoing story, the story that would define any journalist's career if they pursued it with genuine rigor, is the relationship between the power plant, its violations, and the town's health. And Brockman has never pursued that story. He covers celebrity scandals. He covers local peculiarities. He breaks news about alien sightings and alien reveals and the various spectacular events that constitute Springfield's daily life. He does a segment called Eye on Springfield that approaches local issues with the depth of a late-night infomercial. He does not investigate the plant. He does not commission studies about the water supply. He does not hire scientists to analyze the three-eyed fish or connect the biological evidence in the river to the biological characteristics of the town's human population. This is not because Brockman is uniquely lazy or uniquely corrupt. It is because the story is owned by Burns in the same way the town is owned by Burns. The advertising revenue that sustains local media in a town like Springfield flows through the businesses and institutions that Burns controls or influences. A local news operation that aggressively investigates the most powerful person in its community is a local news operation that will find itself with fewer resources and less institutional support than one that does not. This is not a conspiracy that requires explicit coordination. It operates through the same logic of dependency that keeps Homer at the plant and Abe's silence intact. The arrangement is self-maintaining. It does not need a manager because everyone inside it already knows what it requires of them. The medical establishment deserves particular attention in the context of Burns's institutional web. Because the medical establishment in Springfield is the institution whose failure is most directly and most personally harmful to the people Burns has contaminated. If Springfield's doctors were performing their function honestly, if they were connecting the biological evidence their patients presented to the environmental cause of that evidence, if they were documenting and reporting what the town's health data actually showed, the paper trail leading back to the plant would be extensive enough to force regulatory action regardless of what Burns's political relationships could neutralize. Springfield's doctors are not performing that function. Dr. Hibbert, the Simpson family's primary physician, is affable, professionally established, and consistently ineffective as a diagnostic presence. The show uses his character primarily for the laugh of his reaction to serious medical news, the genial chuckle at the news of a fatal diagnosis, the warm smile that accompanies information that should produce alarm. He is charming. He is useless. He treats the symptoms his patients present without connecting them to their environmental cause, without asking the questions about radiation exposure that a doctor practicing in the shadow of a nuclear facility with 342 violations should be asking, without building the medical record that might, over time, constitute evidence. Dr. Nick, the show's other significant medical figure, represents a different kind of institutional failure. Where Hibbert is reassuringly warm but diagnostically incurious, Nick is actively incompetent, a doctor whose qualifications are questionable and whose practices are dangerous. His presence in Springfield's medical landscape serves the same structural function as Homer's presence in the plant's safety inspector role. He provides the appearance of medical service while guaranteeing that the service does not produce the kind of systematic, evidence-based documentation that would threaten existing arrangements. Burns has his own medical staff, his own physicians who understand his condition and manage his treatments. These are people whose employment depends on Burns's continued survival and who therefore have every incentive to maintain his health through whatever means necessary. They are not bound by any community obligation. They are not part of Springfield's institutional fabric in any way that connects them to the town's population. They are Burns's private infrastructure, maintained separately from everything else, insulated from the town's medical ecosystem in the same way that Burns's private wealth insulates him from the town's economic conditions. Springfield's population gets Dr. Hibbert and Dr. Nick. Burns gets a team of specialists whose loyalty is purchased and therefore reliable. The educational system is another node in Burns's institutional network, though its connection to him is less direct than the others. Springfield Elementary's physical collapse as a financial institution, the result of Burns drilling for oil beneath it, is the most explicit evidence of Burns's direct interference with education. But the broader effect of Burns's presence on the town's educational environment operates at a more systemic level. A population whose cognitive function is compromised by chronic radiation exposure produces children whose cognitive function is compromised. Those children attend Springfield Elementary, which is chronically underfunded, staffed by a principal who is not who he claims to be, teaching in facilities that are inadequate and occasionally structurally dangerous. The outcome is a generation of Springfield residents who are even less equipped than their parents to understand what is being done to them. This is the mechanism by which Burns's harm compounds across generations. The adults are cognitively compromised by exposure. The children are born into the same environment, absorb the same contamination, attend the same underfunded school, and emerge into the same economy with the same compromised capacity to ask the questions that the previous generation also could not quite form. Each generation is slightly more dependent on Burns than the one before it. Each generation is slightly less equipped to challenge him. The loop tightens. The system becomes more stable. Burns becomes less accountable with each passing decade because the population whose accountability might theoretically threaten him becomes less capable of providing it. This is not an accident. This is the predictable consequence of the choices Burns has made, compounded over time, operating without interruption because the institutions that might interrupt them have been brought within the orbit of his influence. Springfield is not a victim of circumstance. Springfield is a victim of design. There is one institution in Springfield that exists entirely outside Burns's institutional web and that functions in its way as a genuine check on his power. It just happens to be the most chaotic, unreliable, and structurally incoherent institution in the town's history. The mob. The people of Springfield, individually compromised by contamination and institutional dependence, collectively retain the capacity for spontaneous rage. They form mobs at the slightest provocation. They burn things. They march. They bring pitchforks to situations that do not require pitchforks. The show uses this characteristic to comment on the irrationality of crowd behavior, but it also shows you something else. The mob is the one social mechanism in Springfield that Burns cannot purchase, cannot intimidate, and cannot reliably predict or control. It is not organized enough to be corrupted. It is not institutional enough to be captured. It responds to immediate emotional triggers in ways that bypass the rational calculation that Burns excels at influencing. This is why Burns took the risk of blocking the sun. He understood probably that removing Smithers and proceeding with the scheme was dangerous in a way that his other maneuvers had not been. He understood that visible, immediate, sky-level harm to the entire community was the kind of thing that bypassed the institutional insulation he had built. But he also understood that the mob, in Springfield, is ultimately self-defeating. It gathers. It rages. It produces exactly enough chaos to give Burns a problem. And then it dissipates, because mobs require continuous fuel, and the people of Springfield, once their immediate energy is spent, will return to their homes and their routines and the comfortable acceptance of things as they are. The shot on the sundial, the hospitalization, the recovery, the return to normal. The mob, for once, produced a consequence that lasted longer than the gathering. The consequence was a bullet in Burns. The consequence required a recovery period. But the consequence did not break the institutional web. It did not produce accountability. It did not change anything structural about the relationship between Burns and Springfield. It produced a mystery, which is, in its own way, another kind of control. A mystery requires everyone to look at the question of who shot Burns, which is more interesting and more manageable than the question of why someone was finally willing to. Section 8. The children he poisoned. There are 5 children who live at the center of the Simpsons universe. 3 of them are Simpsons, born to parents who have spent their entire adult lives absorbing the output of Burns's plant. 1 is Bart, 10 years old, frozen in time, his biology fixed at the age he was when the show began. 1 is Lisa, 8, brilliant, isolated, carrying a weight of intelligence in a town designed to punish it. 1 is Maggie, 1-year-old for 36 years, behind her pacifier, watching everything, saying nothing. Then there is Nelson Muntz, whose home situation the show handles with an affection that does not quite conceal how genuinely terrible it is. And there is Ralph Wiggum, the chief of police's son, whose relationship with reality is the most cheerfully surreal of any character in the show's regular rotation. All of these children were born in Springfield. All of them were born to parents who were in Springfield before them. All of them have grown up drinking the same water, breathing the same air, attending the same underfunded school, living in the shadow of the same cracked cooling towers that their parents grew up under. All of them carry, in their biology and their neurology and their developmental profiles, the accumulated consequence of everything Burns has done to the town they were born into. Bart first. The show has always positioned Bart as the Simpson who most visibly embodies the chaos of Springfield's conditions. His impulsiveness, his inability to think past the immediate present, His spectacular academic failure across 36 years of elementary school. His resistance to any form of authority that would require him to sit still and engage with a system that, by the way, was specifically designed by Seymour Skinner, a man who is not actually Seymour Skinner, operating in a school that had its budget collapsed by the extraction of oil from beneath its foundations. Bart's intelligence is not low. The show establishes this in moments scattered across its run. He is creative, resourceful, and capable of sophisticated deception when motivated. He has solved problems that stump adults. He has, on occasion, demonstrated precisely the kind of lateral thinking and adaptive capacity that suggests a mind working at a higher register than his academic performance would indicate. But he cannot sit still. He cannot sustain focus. He cannot engage with systems that require him to defer gratification or absorb information that does not immediately connect to something urgent. He is, in clinical terms, a child whose neurodevelopment has been disrupted in ways that manifest as attention and behavioral regulation difficulties. The show treats this as a personality. It is also a symptom: lead exposure, mercury exposure, radiation exposure, the neurological profile that Bart presents across 36 seasons, the impulsivity, the difficulty with sustained attention, the behavioral dysregulation, the academic underperformance despite evident baseline intelligence, is consistent with the neurodevelopmental effects of environmental contamination in early childhood. Burns's plant has been providing Springfield's children with those exposures their entire lives. The cracked cooling towers do not stay closed. The waste that was dumped on the playgrounds did not vanish. The water that carries plutonium runoff from the facility does not discriminate between adult consumers and the children who drink it. Bart is Springfield's contamination made visible in the classroom. His behavior is not a personality quirk. It is a data point. Lisa's situation is different and, in some ways, darker. Lisa is brilliant. Genuinely, demonstrably, measurably brilliant. Her intelligence is her defining characteristic, the axis around which everything else in her story turns. And her intelligence in Springfield is a source of unrelenting suffering. She is isolated by it. She is mocked for it. She is dismissed by the adults around her, treated as a curiosity by the educational system, and largely ignored by the community she tries, episode after episode, to improve. The show frames Lisa's isolation as a comment on the treatment of intelligence in anti-intellectual environments. Springfield is a community that does not value what Lisa has to offer. She is ahead of her context. Her saxophone, her activism, her reading habits, her persistent insistence on engaging with the world at the level of ideas rather than instinct, all of these mark her as different in ways that Springfield consistently punishes. But there is something else operating underneath that framing. Lisa exists in a family and a community whose cognitive environment has been systematically degraded. Her father's IQ has been measured at 55. Her grandfather is the man who made a deal with the enemy. The adults around her, in her home, and in her school, and in her community, have been living inside Burns's contamination zone their entire lives. Their capacity for the kind of critical thinking that Lisa represents, the capacity to ask difficult questions and follow them wherever they lead, has been eroded. Not completely, not uniformly, but consistently enough that a child who retains that capacity in full stands out with an almost painful vividness against the background of Springfield's cognitive landscape. Lisa's isolation is partly the natural condition of genuine intelligence in any environment. But it is also partly the specific product of a contamination that has affected everyone around her in ways it has not affected her, for reasons the show never fully explains. Maybe she is just lucky in her specific genetics. Maybe the mutations that reduced her father's function amplified hers. Maybe the same radiation that took something from Homer gave something to his youngest daughter. Whatever the mechanism, the result is that Lisa carries the full cognitive weight of what a person can be in a community of people who have had that capacity systematically taken from them. And the cruelest thing about this is that Burns's contamination did not take Lisa's intelligence. It took her audience. It took the community that might have valued her, challenged her, given her interlocutors worthy of what she has to offer. It surrounded her with the casualties of its own operation, and then left her there, the one fully functional mind in a room full of people who cannot quite follow what she is saying. Maggie is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk reliably. She communicates through pacifier sounds and pointed silences. She is, by every developmental measure, an infant. And she is the most cognitively capable character in the show, the most strategically intelligent, the most situationally aware, the one whose plans succeed, whose observations are accurate, whose understanding of what is happening around her is cleaner and more complete than that of any adult in her vicinity. The show plays this for comedy. The gap between Maggie's apparent developmental state and her actual cognitive function is a recurring source of the particular kind of humor that comes from dramatic irony, from the audience knowing something that the characters in the story do not. We see Maggie organizing the daycare rebellion. We see her executing multi-step plans with the precision of a trained operative. We see her in the final shot of the Burns shooting episode, alone in the room, checking to make sure no one is watching before she reenacts the shooting in private. The behavior of someone who understands consequences, who understands observation, who understands that some actions require privacy in ways that ordinary babies are not capable of understanding. But Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is not only a comedic device, it is also, under the radiation theory, the other side of the contamination coin. If the plant's output can reduce Homer's IQ to 55, impair his cognitive function, compromise his neurological capacity to connect causes and effects, then the same environmental cause acting on different genetic substrates might produce entirely different outcomes. Radiation does not perform uniform operations. It interacts with biology in ways that are complex, unpredictable, and variable across individuals. What diminishes one organism might, under different circumstances and with different genetics, amplify another. Maggie may be what happens when radiation goes the other way. When the mutation, instead of taking cognitive capacity away, supercharges it to levels that cannot be properly measured. Same water, same air, same cooling towers, but different biological response. Homer and Maggie are the poles of what Burns's contamination has done to the Simpson family. The father reduced to a figure of comedy, surviving injuries that should kill him but unable to understand the architecture of his own suffering. The daughter elevated to a strategic intelligence that surpasses every adult around her, hidden behind a pacifier and a baby's silence, waiting for a moment the show has never quite defined. And they are father and daughter. They share biology. They share a home. They share the same contaminated water supply. The difference between them is not circumstance. It is the specific, unpredictable, deeply unfair way that Burns's plant has expressed itself in two different bodies that happen to share the same genes. The show also populates Springfield with a wider population of children whose conditions suggest the cumulative biological effect of living near a nuclear facility with 342 safety violations. Ralph Wiggum's relationship with reality is treated as an endearing quirk, a source of some of the show's most beloved non-sequitur humor. His utterances are disconnected from context in ways that suggest a cognitive profile quite different from standard development. His emotional affect is warm, but his processing of cause and effect, of social cues, of the sequential logic that underpins most social interaction, is idiosyncratic in ways that are never explained and never questioned within the show's universe. Nelson Muntz is aggressive, impulsive, and emotionally defended in ways consistent with both a genuinely difficult home environment and the neurological effects of environmental exposure. His home situation is terrible. His emotional environment is one of the show's most honestly handled difficult realities, a child effectively abandoned by both parents, surviving through a combination of aggression and gallows humor. But the neurological texture of his behavior, the specific shape of his impulsivity, and his difficulty regulating what he feels versus what he expresses, maps onto the same contamination profile as Bart. These children did not choose this. They were born into it. They were born into a town that had been contaminated for decades before they arrived, born to parents who had been absorbing that contamination for years, and they inherited the consequences in their neurology and their biology and the specific, limiting shape of the cognitive environments they developed inside. Burns does not know their names. He barely knows Homer's name. He has no relationship with the children of Springfield that goes beyond occasionally using them as props in schemes that require a human presence he can dismiss and discard. They are not people to him. They are part of the landscape, like the three-eyed fish. like the luminous rats, like the cooling towers breaking the Springfield skyline. But they are people. They are the children of a contaminated town, carrying in their bodies the evidence of what one man's calculation cost them before they were old enough to have any say in it. They are the clearest proof that Burns's crimes are not victimless. They are not abstract environmental harms or regulatory violations or accounting entries on a compliance ledger. They are children. They are Ralph Wiggum saying something that does not make sense to anyone else in the room because the room has stopped making sense to him. They are Bart Simpson unable to sit still in a classroom in a school built over a site where Burns drilled for oil. They are Lisa Simpson playing her saxophone alone in a room because the town that should have been her community has been cognitively flattened by the thing in the river and the thing in the water and the thing in the sky above all of them. They are Maggie, 1-year-old forever, watching everything with eyes that understand more than anyone around her suspects, waiting behind her pacifier, in a home that runs on electricity from the plant that made her father into what he is and might have made her into what she is and is still running, still leaking, still feeding the contaminated water supply that all of them drink from every single day. That is Burns's legacy, not the empire, not the immortality, not the 742 undocumented errors and the cracked cooling towers and the political relationships and the deal with Abe. The legacy is these children, the ones who cannot sit still, the ones who play saxophone alone, the ones who watch everything and say nothing, the ones whose grasp on consensus reality is loose in ways that make them funny until you think too hard about why. They are what Burns's arithmetic looks like in practice. They are what it costs when a man decides that $56 million to bring a plant into compliance is a price not worth paying. Not in money, not to him, in children, in Springfield, in the town he owns. Section 9. The moments nobody noticed. The big Burns crimes get attention. The sun-blocking machine, the biological weapons lab, the contaminated water supply, the deal with Abe. These are the dramatic turning points, the moments that define the shape of Burns's villainy in the show's mythology. But Burns's relationship with Springfield is not only composed of dramatic gestures, most of it is smaller. Most of it is the accumulated weight of 100 decisions made in passing, incidents the show deposits in the background of other stories, actions that receive a laugh and then vanish from the narrative, leaving behind them a residue that the audience rarely stops to examine. These smaller moments matter. In some ways, they matter more than the large ones, because the large ones have the shape of villainy. They are recognizable. When Burns builds a sun-blocking machine, the audience knows what it is watching. When he runs a biological weapons lab and drives Mona Simpson underground, the moral stakes are clear. But the small Burns moments, the ones that pass in a sentence or a visual gag, are the ones that reveal the texture of his ordinary operation. The way he behaves when he is not constructing a dramatic scheme, the things he does because they are simply how he moves through the world, without requiring a plan or an objective beyond the immediate satisfaction of his preferences. Let us start with Smithers. The relationship between Burns and Wayland Smithers Jr. is the longest-running and most emotionally complex relationship in the show's history. Smithers has dedicated his adult life to Burns, not in the sense of committed professional service, though it is that too. In the sense of total personal devotion, Smithers has organized his entire existence around Burns's needs, schedule, comfort, and survival. He has subordinated his own desires, his own social life, his own chance at any of the ordinary human experiences that constitute a life in service of a man who regards him as a particularly useful piece of furniture. Burns is aware of Smithers's feelings. He is not oblivious to them. He knows, in the way that a person who has spent a century reading people knows, exactly where Smithers stands and what Smithers wants and what the shape of that wanting means. And he has chosen, repeatedly, deliberately, to make no accommodation for it, not to reciprocate, which would be too much to ask of Burns, but also not to release Smithers from the arrangement, not to acknowledge Smithers's feelings in any way that would give Smithers the clarity to make a different choice. Burns keeps Smithers in a state of permanent, unresolved proximity, close enough to maintain the devotion that makes Smithers useful, distant enough to prevent the devotion from resolving into anything that would make Smithers his equal. This is not oversight. Burns is not accidentally failing to notice Smithers. He is managing him. with the same cold precision he applies to everything else. Smithers's unrequited devotion is the most reliable form of loyalty Burns could have. A person who loves you and is not loved back does not stop loving you. They simply redirect the energy of their longing into service. They make themselves more useful in the hope that usefulness will eventually be recognized as deserving of the love they are offering. Burns understands this. He understands it because he has been managing Smithers for decades, and the system has always worked exactly as he needed it to. And here is the darker layer. Smithers is the keystone of Burns's survival infrastructure. He is the person who ensures the weekly treatments are administered, who manages the schedule that keeps the disease equilibrium intact, who is irreplaceable in a way that Burns's genuine enemies are not. If you wanted to kill Burns, the most effective strategy would not be to confront him directly. It would be to remove Smithers. Without Smithers managing the protocol, Burns misses a treatment. The equilibrium collapses. He dies. Burns has never told Smithers this. He has never acknowledged, in any terms, that his survival depends on Smithers's continued presence. Because acknowledging this would give Smithers power. Real, structural, undeniable power over Burns's continued existence. And Burns does not give power to anyone, not even to the person who is, in the most literal sense, keeping him alive. So Smithers continues his devotion without knowing its true weight. He manages Burns's survival without understanding that his own departure would end it. He is both indispensable and uninformed of his indispensability. And Burns, who knows all of this with perfect clarity, allows the situation to continue because it serves him more effectively than any alternative. Every time Burns dismisses Smithers, every time he fails to acknowledge Smithers's feelings, every time he fires him and then rehires him when the immediate crisis passes, every single one of these is a small, precise act of cruelty that the show treats as characterization rather than violence. But it is violence. It is the violence of a person who has identified exactly where someone else's feelings are most exposed and has chosen, over decades, to press that point with the consistency of a man who simply does not care. Now, the workers. Burns's relationship with his workforce, the people who actually operate the plant, who are exposed to its conditions every day, who absorb its output in the most immediate possible way because they spend 8 hours a day inside its walls, is the most direct expression of his contempt for human welfare when it conflicts with operational efficiency. There is the matter of the plant's labor relations. The workers have attempted across various episodes to unionize, to organize, to collectively negotiate for the basic safety conditions and compensation improvements that their work environment, by any reasonable measure, requires. Burns has responded to every such attempt with the specific, targeted cruelty of a man who has been defeating labor actions since before labor relations was a formal legal concept. He knows how to break a strike. He knows how to identify the weak points in an organizing committee. He knows which workers are most financially vulnerable, which ones have families that cannot afford a prolonged dispute, which ones have personal histories that make them susceptible to private pressure. And he uses all of this, systematically, with the patience of someone who has outlived every union organizer he has ever defeated. The scab workers he brings in during labor disputes are themselves a notable detail. Burns's willingness to import replacement workers without regard for their qualifications or their health and safety situations is not a desperation measure. It is a demonstration. He brings in scabs not because he needs them to keep the plant running. He could afford to keep the plant idle indefinitely without feeling it, but because using them is the clearest possible signal to his regular workforce of what he thinks of their leverage. They are replaceable. Their skills do not matter. Their continued employment is a privilege he extends at his discretion and withdraws the moment they become inconvenient. The episode where Homer temporarily takes on a union organizing role, becoming a labor representative, is one of the show's most formally complex treatments of Burns's relationship with organized labor. It is played largely for comedy, as Homer's incompetence and eventual capitulation produce the story beats the episode needs. But the background negotiating positions are real. Burns's opening offers to the workers are not realistic negotiating positions. They are insults. They are the formal articulation of what Burns thinks about the people who work for him and about the concept of collective bargaining as a mechanism for limiting what he can require of them. He offers dental but with the specific dental provisions, structured to be essentially uncoverable for the conditions most common in a workforce exposed to the plant's conditions. He offers healthcare but with the plan design that maximizes the gap between what the coverage appears to provide and what it actually covers when claims are submitted. He offers retirement benefits structured around assumptions about employee longevity that are, given the plant's environmental output, genuinely optimistic to the point of being insulting. All of this is presented quickly. The show moves through it in service of Homer's plotline, but the detail is there. Burns's benefits package for his workers is designed the same way. His compliance relationship with regulators is designed to create the appearance of provision while minimizing its actual cost, to give the workforce something they can point to as evidence that they are valued while ensuring that the something costs Burns as little as possible and benefits the workers as little as can be arranged. There are also the smaller, more personal moments. Burns's treatment of individual workers who cross his path in ways that are not strategically significant. The janitor he encounters in a hallway and does not recognize as a person. The maintenance worker whose safety concern he ignores in a meeting. The long-tenured employee he fires for reasons so trivial they function as exercises in the application of arbitrary power, which is exactly what they are. Burns's authority over his workers is not purely economic. He exercises it in the personal dimension too. He fires people for aesthetic reasons. For the crime of being in his peripheral vision when he is in a particular mood. For having a face he finds unpleasant. He does this because he can, not because it serves any strategic purpose, because the option exists. The option always exists for Burns. That is the thing. Every terrible small thing he does is predicated on the existence of the option. He can fire someone on a whim. He can deny a safety upgrade because he does not want to spend the money. He can watch his workers absorb contamination without notifying them of the risk. He can take the oil from under the school. He can deny the retirement home residents the land their facility sits on. All of these options are available to him. And unlike most people who have access to terrible options, Burns exercises them regularly, with a consistency that suggests not malice exactly. Malice implies emotion, but the complete and total absence of the internal friction that prevents most people from doing harmful things when they technically could. Most people do not do harmful things they technically could do because some combination of empathy, social norm, legal consequence, and personal ethics creates resistance. Burns has none of those resistances in working order. His empathy, if it ever existed, was replaced long ago by calculation. Social norms are things that apply to other people. Legal consequences, as we have established, have been comprehensively insulated from reaching him. And his personal ethics are the ethics of a man who believes, at the foundational level of his worldview, that the ability to do something is the only qualification required to do it. There is the matter of the power plant's gift shop. Not a significant plot point. Not a dramatic moment. A background detail that appears in one episode and is never returned to. The Springfield nuclear power plant has a gift shop. Burns sells merchandise branded with the image of his own nuclear facility to the population his facility is contaminating. He sells keychains and mugs and t-shirts decorated with the cooling tower logo to people whose drinking water comes from the same watershed his plant has been compromising for decades. He charges them for the privilege of advertising his ownership of their town. The gift shop is tiny. It is background set dressing. It is also a perfect distillation of the relationship between Burns and Springfield. He has taken everything from them and they are paying him for a commemorative mug to remember it by. There is the matter of his treatment of animals. Burns's casual cruelty toward non-human life is documented across dozens of episodes and almost universally played for comedy. He runs over squirrels without noticing or caring. He has no relationship with the natural world except as a resource to be extracted or an obstacle to be removed. His plan at one point to make a coat from the skins of puppies, from the specific puppies of a specific dog owned by the very people working for him, is so baroque in its specific cruelty that the show uses it as a climactic plot device rather than a throwaway gag. He wanted a puppy fur coat. He attempted to steal puppies from his employees to make it. When this was discovered and stopped, he expressed no comprehension of why anyone would find this objectionable. That last detail is important, not the plan. The incomprehension of the objection. Burns is not simply willing to do terrible things. He is genuinely confused by the idea that terrible things require justification. His mind does not contain the category of action that should not be taken for reasons unrelated to strategic outcome. The puppies were available. He wanted a coat. The connection between those two facts and the action of taking the puppies was, for Burns, as straightforward as any other resource acquisition. The fact that the puppies belonged to people who worked for him, who had emotional attachments to them, who would be directly harmed by their loss, was not a factor that registered in Burns's calculation. This is the texture of ordinary Burns, not the dramatic schemes, not the sun-blocking machine. Just a man who wanted a coat and did not understand why he could not have it, because in Burns's long experience, wanting something has always been sufficient reason to pursue it, and being opposed has always been a logistics problem rather than a moral one. The show has, across 36 seasons, accumulated an enormous catalog of these smaller moments. Burns cutting the power during a critical moment in someone's life because he noticed it was costing money. Burns canceling community programs he had promised to fund after extracting whatever political benefit the promise generated. Burns attending events in Springfield where his presence produces discomfort and treating that discomfort as a form of tribute. Burns being told something terrible has happened to a community member and responding with the specific expression of someone who has understood the information and determined it to be irrelevant. Each of these individually is a character beat, a laugh, or a darkly dry moment. Collectively, they constitute the daily texture of what it is like to live in a town that one man owns. Not the dramatic cruelty of the sun-blocking schemes or the biological weapons labs. The ordinary cruelty of being surrounded, every day, by the evidence that the most powerful presence in your community does not regard you as a person. That is the most comprehensive catalog of Burns's small crimes. The ones nobody noticed because each one, individually, was too small to notice. It is only when you stop and lay them out next to each other, one after another, across 36 years of episodes, that you begin to see the thing they form together. Not a collection of isolated incidents, a pattern, a sustained, uninterrupted, utterly consistent pattern of a man expressing, through every interaction with every institution and every person in his sphere, the same fundamental orientation toward the world. Everything is mine, everyone is a variable, and none of them matter. Section 10, The Man Who Could Have Changed Everything. There is a Burns the show occasionally shows you, briefly, in flashes, in moments so rare that they feel like glimpses into a parallel version of the character. A Burns who is almost human. A Burns who contains, somewhere very deep inside the century of calculation and accumulated cruelty, something that resembles the capacity for feeling. These moments are important not because they redeem Burns. He is not redeemed. He cannot be redeemed by what the show gives him, but because they make his villainy worse, demonstrably, provably worse, because they prove he knows better. The most famous of these is Bobo, the teddy bear. The childhood companion Burns lost and has never stopped seeking. This is the detail the show returns to when it wants to remind you that Burns was once a child, once had uncomplicated feelings, once loved something with the total, unguarded love that only children and certain adults with nothing left to lose are capable of. He loved a bear named Bobo. The bear was lost. And in Burns's specific psychology, that loss created a wound that every subsequent decade of wealth and power and institutional domination has failed to fill. There is an episode built around Bobo, around the bear's passage through Springfield's history and its eventual return to Burns. The episode is structured as a comedy about a stuffed toy, but the emotional logic underneath it is genuinely painful. Burns wants the bear back. He wants it in the way that a very old man wants a very specific thing from a very long ago, with an intensity that cannot be explained by the object's intrinsic value and can only be explained by what the object represents. The last thing that was taken from him before he learned not to care about things being taken from him. The last love that predates the calculation. And when he gets the bear back, when Bobo is finally in his hands again after decades of searching, what happens to Burns is the most human thing the show has ever depicted him experiencing. He softens. Not permanently. Not in any way that survives the next episode's reset. But in that moment, briefly, the armor comes off, the calculation stops, and what is underneath is exactly what you suspected. a grief-saturated old man who wanted something back that cannot actually be given back, because the thing he lost was not the bear. It was the version of himself that loved it. He puts the armor back on, he returns to form. The next episode does not reference Bobo. The moment passes. But you saw it. The show wanted you to see it. Not to forgive Burns. It gives you no grounds for forgiveness, but to understand the specific shape of what he became. This is someone who had the capacity for feeling and was not protected, who had a childhood that produced a wound, and whose response to that wound was not to seek connection or healing or the kind of ordinary human engagement that wounds require, but to build walls of such thickness, to accumulate power of such weight that nothing could reach him again. Nothing could be taken from him again, because there would be nothing left to take, nothing he permitted himself to feel, nothing vulnerable enough to become a loss. The tragedy of Bobo is that it proves the cruelty was a choice, not a compulsion, not a biological incapacity for empathy. A choice, made so long ago and so deeply embedded in his operating system that it no longer feels like a choice, but traceable, if you look, back to a specific wound and a specific decision about how to respond to it. He chose the walls. He chose the calculation. He chose to become the man who cannot remember the name of the employee he has worked with for 36 years, because the man who remembers names is the man who can be hurt by their loss. Marge. There is an episode where Burns falls in love with Marge, or something that functions like love in Burns's attenuated emotional vocabulary. The specifics are played for comedy, as they must be, but the sincerity of Burns's fixation on Marge, the particular quality of attention he brings to her, suggests that whatever capacity for genuine feeling survived, Burns's self-imposed emotional lockdown is activated by Marge in a way that almost nothing else is. Marge has the quality of a person who sees you, who pays attention, who brings warmth to interactions without calculation. These are things Burns is surrounded by almost nowhere else in his life. Smithers's devotion, real as it is filtered through the specific distortions of unrequited love. Burns's business relationships are transactional. His political relationships are instrumental. His medical relationships are functional. He is surrounded by people who interact with him as a system rather than as a person. Marge interacts with him as a person, probably because she does not fully understand who he is. But the effect on Burns is real enough for the show to build an episode around it. And the episode confirms that whatever Burns's feelings about Marge are, they exist in a category different from his feelings about everything and everyone else in Springfield. More personal, more direct, less calculated. What is Burns's response to this feeling? Does he act on it in ways that produce genuine connection? Does he let it soften his treatment of the Simpson family? Does it create any lasting accommodation in his behavior toward Homer, the husband of the woman he apparently loves? No. The feeling is acknowledged within the episode, it serves the plot of the episode, and then it is over. Burns's occasional moments of almost humanity produce no lasting change because they cannot. Because the architecture of what Burns has become does not permit lasting change. The feelings arise, they are briefly visible, and then the calculation reasserts itself. Because the calculation has been running longer and has more structural support than any feeling that can survive in the space Burns has left for feelings. This is what makes these moments worse rather than better. A Burns who was simply incapable of feeling anything would be a simpler villain, understandable in a clinical way. But a Burns who can feel, who demonstrably retains the capacity for something resembling love and grief and longing, and who nonetheless continues to do what he does to Springfield and to the people in it, is a Burns who chooses every day to keep the walls up, to maintain the calculation, to let the contamination continue and the violations persist and the people absorb what they absorb, because the alternative is to be the person who feels something about it. He was, once, that person. The child with the bear. The young man who attended Yale with some version of future ahead of him that had not yet been fully narrowed into what he became. The show gives you these glimpses, not as excuses, but as measurements. This is how far he has traveled. This is how much he abandoned. This is the distance between the person who might have been and the person who is. There is also the question of Burns's relationship with his family, such as it is. The show occasionally surfaces Burns' family dynamics, and what they reveal is a lineage of the same cold calculation, the same institutional contempt for ordinary human feeling, the same preference for power over connection. Burns did not invent his worldview. He inherited it, refined it, applied it with more systematic consistency than his predecessors, perhaps, because he has had longer to develop it and more resources to express it. But the Burns family has always been this. The money and the methods and the mentality have been passed down through generations of men who understood the world in terms of what they could take from it. That context does not excuse Burns. It contextualizes him. He is not a self-made monster. He is the latest and most fully realized iteration of a monster that has been in production for generations. And because he has lived so much longer than any of his predecessors, he has had more time to develop the product, to refine the methods, to build the institutional web that makes Springfield so comprehensively his. There is a moment, rare but documented in the show's canon, where Burns expresses something like regret. Not about the plant violations, not about the biological weapons lab or the deal with Abe or the pursuit of Mona or the contamination of the water supply, but about Smithers, about the specific shape of what he has done to the one person who has given him everything and received almost nothing in return. The show handles this moment quickly and does not linger in it, but it is there. A flicker of recognition that the arrangement with Smithers, the most stable relationship Burns has ever had, is built on something that Smithers deserves better than he is receiving. The moment passes. Burns does not change anything. Smithers continues to manage the appointment schedule, and Burns continues to not quite acknowledge what Smithers' management of that schedule means. But the moment was there. Burns saw it and looked away. And looking away, after you have seen, is the thing that separates a person who cannot help what they do from a person who simply will not stop. Burns will not stop. That is the final conclusion the almost human moments deliver. He is not unable to comprehend what he is doing to Springfield, to the Simpson family, to Smithers, to the children who carry his contamination in their biology. He is not cognitively incapable of connecting the three-eyed fish to the cracked cooling towers, to the children with the bulging eyes and the yellow skin, and the disrupted development. He is not unaware that the deal with Abe was a corruption. He is not ignorant of what was done to Mona Simpson, or what her absence meant for Homer's life. He simply does not stop, has never stopped, will not stop as long as the treatments continue and the empire holds, and Springfield continues to produce the electricity bill that keeps the whole arrangement funded. The almost human moments prove this. They prove that the calculation is a choice. They prove that somewhere inside the century of accumulated cruelty there is a person who can feel the weight of it. And they prove that person has looked at the weight and decided, in each moment the choice was available, to put it down, to keep the walls up, to press the steepled fingers together and look out over Springfield from the office window and continue, as he has always continued, with the business at hand. Section 11: Springfield's complicity. Burns does not operate alone. He never has. The full accounting of what has been done to Springfield requires more than the biography of one man, however comprehensive his villainy. It requires an examination of the town itself, of the population that has absorbed his contamination and elected his preferred politicians and accepted his terms and, in episode after episode, looked up at the cooling towers and decided that they are just part of the landscape. Springfield is not an innocent victim. This is the hardest thing to say about the show, the most uncomfortable truth that emerges from 36 seasons of carefully observed community dysfunction. Springfield is a victim, genuinely and demonstrably, of what Burns has done to it. But it is also a participant. It has participated in its own domination through a series of choices, individual and collective, that have each made the next choice marginally easier and the one before it marginally more justified. Start with the vote. The Springfield Files gives you Blinky, the three-eyed fish, and the moment when a political candidate tried to use environmental evidence to force accountability on Burns. The town watched the candidate eat the fish. The town watched Burns survive the challenge. The town then voted for Burns's preferred outcome, the candidate's defeat, with enough regularity and consistency that Burns has never, in 36 seasons, faced a political challenge that seriously threatened his position. Some of this is the structural consequence of contamination. A population whose critical thinking has been compromised by radiation is going to be less effective at evaluating political claims about the source of that radiation. The cognitive fog is real. The impairment is real. But cognitive impairment is not the complete explanation for how Springfield votes. Because the show also depicts residents who are capable of anger, capable of organizing, capable of the kind of collective action that the town meeting before the Burns shooting represents. They can gather, they can feel outrage, they can reach for weapons. The capacity for resistance exists. What fails is not the capacity, it is the follow-through. Springfield's political energy is intense and short-lived. It flares, produces a moment of collective intensity, and then subsides back into the comfortable acceptance of things as they are. This is not only a product of contamination. This is also a community that has learned, over decades of living under Burns's economic dominance, that the cost of sustained resistance exceeds the benefit. The economic dependency is real. Without Burns's plant, Springfield's economy collapses. Without Springfield's economy, the community that has been built up around it ceases to function. The choice to resist Burns is not a free choice. It is a choice made in a context where the alternative to Burns is not a better Burns. It is nothing. Darkness. Economic dissolution. The dispersal of a community that, whatever its faults, is home. People protect their home, even when their home is contaminated. Even when the protection costs them their health and their children's neurology and their grandchildren's futures. They protect it because it is what they have, and they cannot imagine what a different version of it might look like. This is how Burns's complicity works. He did not create Springfield's dependency on him in an environment where alternatives existed. He built the plant and the dependency simultaneously, ensuring that by the time Springfield understood what it had agreed to, the agreement was no longer practically reversible. There is no version of the discussion that does not begin from the position that the plant is too embedded to remove. Burns made sure of that, before the first violation was documented. Before the first three-eyed fish appeared in the river, he built the dependency first and the harm second, and in that sequencing lies the genius of his particular form of exploitation. Abe Simpson's deal is the clearest individual expression of the collective complicity. Abe had a chance, a real, documented, potentially consequential chance to do something about Burns. He had evidence of a crime, he had leverage, and he traded it for his son's job security, not maliciously, not out of any love for Burns or hatred for his family, out of the ordinary, understandable, entirely human desire to protect the person he loved in the way he knew how. He got Homer a job. He made sure Homer would be employed, would have stability, would not be abandoned by the economic system the way Abe perhaps felt he had been. The tragedy is that the job Abe secured for Homer is in the facility that is poisoning Homer. The deal Abe made to protect his son placed his son in the middle of the thing Abe should have fought against. And Abe knew this, or should have known this. The calculus was there. He just ran it differently than the town's interests required, and arrived at a personal solution to a structural problem that demanded something more. Every Springfield resident who has shrugged at the three-eyed fish has done a version of Abe's calculation. Every voter who chose not to challenge Burns's candidate. Every journalist who found a safer story to cover. Every doctor who treated the symptoms without investigating the cause. Every teacher who absorbed the budget cuts from the stolen oil well and kept showing up to work. Every person who has ever looked at those cooling towers and decided not to think too hard about what they meant, all of them have made Abe's deal in miniature. The personal comfort of not knowing, not fighting, not risking the stability of what they have, in exchange for the quiet, continued operation of a system that is killing them. It is not fair to judge them harshly for this. It is barely possible to judge them at all once you understand the full shape of what they are inside. They are fish in contaminated water, slowly adapting to conditions that should not be survivable, mistaking the adaptation for normalcy because they have no reference for what the water used to feel like. They are people whose brains have been affected by the same contamination they should be resisting, whose capacity to imagine alternatives has been compromised by the very thing they should be imagining alternatives to. But complicity is still complicity even when it is produced by circumstance. Springfield has chosen, repeatedly and collectively, to maintain the fiction of normalcy, to accept the reset, to forget the catastrophes, to expel the truth-tellers and keep the liars. The Principal and the Pauper is the show's most explicit mapping of this, the episode where you get to see the mechanism that runs beneath every other episode's reset. The town votes to forget. The town makes forgetting legal. The town sends the real Seymour Skinner away on a train and then goes home and does not talk about it. Springfield does this for Burns every day. Every day that the cooling towers are on the skyline and nobody calls the EPA. Every day that the water comes out of the tap and nobody demands a chemical analysis. Every day that another child goes to Springfield Elementary with neurological characteristics consistent with environmental contamination, and no doctor connects those characteristics to their source. Every day is a vote, a small, quiet, unacknowledged vote to maintain the arrangement, to keep Burns at the top of the structure, to allow the loop to continue turning. This is not an indictment of Springfield. It is a description of how systems of power actually function. They do not maintain themselves through force. Not primarily. They maintain themselves through the 1,000 daily accommodations of people who understand, on some level, that challenging the system is possible, but concluding, on every level that matters, that it is not worth it. The cost is too high. The alternatives are too uncertain. The thing that would be lost in the resistance is more immediately dear than the thing that might be gained from it. Burns has spent over a century engineering exactly this calculation in the population of Springfield. He has made the cost of resistance just high enough, and the alternatives just uncertain enough, and the immediate comfort of acceptance just sufficient enough that the calculation always comes out the same way, every time, for every person, in every generation, until someone shoots him on a sundial. And then the calculation resets, and everything goes back to the way it was. Section 12. The Final Reckoning. We have spent a long time in Springfield. We have walked through the contaminated streets. We have looked at the cooling towers from every angle. We have followed Burns through the biological weapons lab, and the back rooms of political negotiations and the hospital bed where he recovered from a bullet wound that should have changed everything and changed nothing. We have traced the lines of his influence through institutions that were supposed to protect the town from exactly what he was doing to it. We have looked at the faces of the children his plant made, and the father his grudge broke, and the mother his phone call exiled. It is time to do what the show has never fully done, to put it all together, to look at everything at once and answer the question that the show has been circling for 36 years without ever quite landing on it directly. What is Charles Montgomery Burns? He is not the caricature villain the show's comedic register sometimes suggests. He is not the bumbling old man who moves too slowly and cannot remember Homer's name. He is not a collection of comedic character notes arranged into something that generates the particular humor of very old wealth rendered absurd. He is something more specific and more accurate than any of those descriptions, something that the show's careful accumulation of detail, deposited across hundreds of episodes over 3.5 decades, adds up to if you are willing to take the sum seriously. Burns is a system, not a person operating a system. The system itself, given a body, given a name, given an impossible longevity that allows it to persist long past the point where accountability might have arrived if it were merely human. The power plant is the visible expression of the system. The biological weapons lab was another expression. The deal with Abe. The pursuit of Mona. The employment of Homer. The political relationships. The medical infrastructure that extends his survival. The institutional capture that eliminates accountability. All of these are not separate crimes. They are components of the same system, a system whose function is the maintenance of Burns's dominance over Springfield, and whose side effects include everything that has ever happened to every person in this town that should not have happened. Systems do not feel remorse. This is why the almost human moments, the Bobo glimpses and the Marge episodes and the flicker of recognition about Smithers, do not resolve into change. Burns contains a person. The system he has become does not accommodate persons. The system runs on calculation, on the arithmetic of power and dependency and the managed suppression of resistance, and it keeps running regardless of what the person inside it feels about any of it, because the person inside it made choices long ago that put the system in place, and the system has outlasted the conditions under which those choices could easily be unmade. The radiation theory, the coma theory, the geographic impossibility of Springfield's location, the Principal and the Pauper's mechanism of collective denial, all of these Springfield mysteries converge on Burns, because Burns is their cause. Not the partial cause, the comprehensive cause. The originating act that set the conditions for everything else. Without Burns's plant, the mutation theory has no mechanism. Without Burns's deal with Abe, Homer is a different person. Without Burns's pursuit of Mona, the Simpson family has a different architecture. Without Burns's domination of Springfield's institutions, the town's collective amnesia has no enforcer. Without Burns's immortality sustaining the system past its natural lifespan, the feedback loop has natural breakpoints where accountability might intrude. Burns is not the villain of individual episodes. He is the villain of the town's entire history. Every episode is another chapter in a story that started before the show did, in a Springfield that existed before cameras arrived to record it, where a very old man with a very old fortune and a very old wound made decisions whose consequences are still propagating, still accumulating, still expressing themselves in yellow skin and four-fingered hands and the particular brilliant silence of a one-year-old behind her pacifier who has been watching everything for 36 years and has not yet decided what to do about it. He has never been called to account. Not fully. Not in any way that stuck, that changed the structure of what he had built, that prevented him from continuing. He was shot on a sundial and he survived. He was nearly bankrupted by the German investors and he bought the plant back. He was politically threatened by Blinky and he served the fish at dinner. He was caught running a biological weapons facility and the only witness was driven underground for 27 years. He was exposed as the force behind Homer's mother's exile, and Homer went back to work on Monday. Every potential reckoning has dissolved. Every accountability mechanism has been absorbed or circumvented or outlasted. The man who told Smithers that no is not an answer has extended that principle across his entire relationship with consequence. No is not an answer. Accountability is not an answer. Retirement is not an answer. Death is not even an answer, or if it is being kept at sufficient distance by weekly radiation treatments and the most sophisticated private medical infrastructure that a century of compound interest can provide. What, then, is the answer? The show does not provide one. 36 seasons and the show does not resolve the Burns problem. He is still there. The plant is still there. The cooling towers are still breaking Springfield's skyline. The water is still coming out of the tap with whatever it has in it. The three-eyed fish are still in the river. Homer is still in Sector 7G. The deal with Abe is still holding its shape in the structure of Homer's employment. Mona is gone. The children carry the contamination in their biology. Smithers manages the appointment schedule. And Burns sits in his office with his fingers steepled, looking down at the town through the window that has never been cleaned, still calculating. The show's refusal to resolve this is not a narrative failure. It is a thesis statement. Systems like Burns do not resolve. They persist. They outlast the specific moments that might have undone them. They adapt. They absorb challenges and recover from them and continue. The reason Springfield cannot get rid of Burns is the same reason that the show cannot write Burns out, because the town and the show are the same thing. They both require the ongoing presence of the thing that should not still be happening. They both depend on the maintenance of an arrangement that everyone can see is wrong, and that nobody knows how to dismantle without destroying everything built around it. This is what the show has been telling you since the first wide shot of Springfield, with the cooling towers on the horizon. Not in the dramatic episodes about biological weapons labs and sun-blocking machines and gubernatorial elections won through the strategic consumption of mutant fish, in the background detail, in the accumulation, in the 36 years of every Springfield establishing shot containing those same two cooling towers, unchanged, operational, present, leaking their invisible output into the water supply that feeds the town that cannot survive without them. The towers are still there, Burns is still there, the system is still running, and Springfield goes about its day. Now here is what you take with you when you leave Springfield tonight, lying wherever you are watching from, letting the familiar images of this town you have known for most of your life settle over you like something comfortable. The Simpsons is a comedy about a family. It is also an honest account of what it looks like when one person has more power than any person should have over a community, and when that community has made enough accommodations to that power over enough time that dismantling it would require dismantling everything. Burns is the villain the show has always known it had. He is the answer to every Springfield mystery, not just some of them. He is the reason the fish have three eyes and the principal is not who he says he is, and Homer's mother is a ghost story, and nobody ages and the water tastes the way it tastes. He is the cracked cooling towers and the plutonium paperweight, and the skeletons in the basement and the luminous rats and the gift shop where you can buy a mug with his plant on it for $12. He is what the show is about underneath everything else. Underneath the couch gags and the celebrity appearances and the predictions and the theories and the decades of jokes that became something more than jokes the longer the show ran, he is Springfield's real climate. Not weather, not the background, the air itself. And every Sunday night, when the show comes on and the camera sweeps over Springfield and you see those cooling towers on the horizon for the 10,000th time, that is Burns reminding you that he is still there, that nothing has changed, that the arrangement is holding, that the loop is still running. He does not need to say it out loud. Springfield already knows. So do you. Rest well. You are safe where you are. The cooling towers are only on the television. For now. If you made it all the way here, thank you for spending this time in Springfield. Every Burns moment we explored tonight was hiding in plain sight across 36 years of the most analyzed show in television history. If this kept you company tonight, subscribe so you never miss the next one. These videos take a long time to make, and knowing you are out there watching makes it worth every hour. Sleep well. End of script. Expansion, the full accounting. Part A. Burns and the architecture of fear, how he keeps a town quiet. The question that should be asked about Springfield is not why Burns has been able to do what he has done for so long. The question is how he ensured that so few people ever gathered the courage, the clarity, or the sustained political will to seriously challenge him. Because the answer to that question reveals something about the mechanics of power that goes beyond the cartoonish specifics of one animated billionaire in one fictional town and into something considerably more recognizable. Burns has never needed to be openly threatening. He has never needed to commission violence or issue explicit warnings or create a regime of fear in the traditional authoritarian sense. He has never needed to do any of that because he has something more effective than fear. He has economic dependency so total and so embedded in the community's survival that the threat does not need to be articulated. It is simply present, the way gravity is present. You do not need to be told that falling is dangerous. You already know. The ground taught you. Every worker in Springfield who considers reporting a plant violation already knows what happens, not because Burns has ever sat them down and explained the consequences, but because the architecture of their employment, their healthcare, their retirement, their family's financial stability is built inside the walls of an enterprise that Burns controls entirely. Reporting the violation does not produce an independent investigation that leads to accountability. It produces, in the workers' lived experience and imagination, a sequence of events that ends with their removal from the economic structure that their family depends on. They do not calculate this consciously every time. They do not sit at their desks and run the numbers on the risk-benefit analysis of whistleblowing. The knowledge lives in their body. It shapes their behavior before any explicit thought is formed. This is how Burns's power actually operates. Not through the dramatic moments, not through the confrontations, through the quiet, pervasive, atmospheric presence of a set of conditions in which challenging the existing arrangement feels not just risky, but structurally impossible, like trying to breathe water. You do not need to be told that breathing water will kill you. You already know. The body already knows. The workers at the plant have seen what happens to people who push back. Not because Burns has made examples of them dramatically, though he has on occasion, because the examples are already present in the structure. The union organizers who tried and failed, the safety concerns that were raised and then buried, the inspections that produced violation counts, and then produced $56 million estimates that led to no action. The entire relationship between the plant and regulatory oversight is an ongoing demonstration that the normal mechanisms of accountability do not function here. That demonstration is its own form of suppression. You do not need to threaten people who have already watched every available avenue of challenge fail. There is also the matter of the community's relationship with what the plant provides. Electricity is not a luxury, not in a modern community, not in a town where the plant is the sole provider. When Burns provides Springfield's electricity, he is providing something closer to a biological necessity than a commercial service. He is providing the condition under which the town's institutions function, under which food is stored, under which hospitals run, under which heating operates in winter and cooling operates in summer. Challenging the plant, threatening its continued operation, is not an abstract political act. It has immediate, tangible consequences for every person in the community who depends on the light coming on when they flip the switch. Burns did not create this dependency accidentally. He built it deliberately. He arrived in Springfield with his plant and his capital, and he made himself the single point of failure in the town's energy infrastructure. Not because that was the most efficient design for a power plant, because that was the most effective design for a mechanism of control. A town with multiple energy sources, with meaningful alternatives, with the structural capacity to function without the plant, is a town that can say no to Burns. A town with one power plant and one owner is a town that cannot. The dependency is so complete, so fundamental to the structure of daily life in Springfield, that Burns does not need to be actively threatening anyone to maintain his position. He simply needs to remain in possession of the plant. The threat of what losing the plant would mean, even unspoken, even unacknowledged, shapes every civic and political interaction in Springfield in ways that make meaningful resistance almost categorically impossible. Almost. Not entirely. The town meeting before the Burns shooting is the show's most explicit acknowledgement that the dependency does not completely eliminate the capacity for collective rage. When Burns blocked the sun, he triggered a response that his structural hold on the town could not absorb. Because blocking the sun was not only an economic threat, it was a biological one. It was an attack on the conditions of life so fundamental, so direct, so impossible to explain away as a regulatory problem or a business decision, that it bypassed all the carefully constructed dependency and landed in the part of Springfield's population that was still capable of genuine outrage. This is the only vulnerability in Burns's power structure, not the economic structure, not the political relationships, not the plant itself. The population's capacity for the kind of rage that is not mediated by economic calculation, the mob, the gathering, the spontaneous, unreflective, immediate response to harm so direct that the normal suppression mechanisms fail to contain it. Burns nearly miscalculated when he blocked the sun. He assumed that his structural dominance was total, that no single action could pierce through the layers of dependency and institutional capture he had spent decades building. He was wrong. The sun is too fundamental. Nobody accepts the loss of the sun as a cost of doing business. Nobody performs a risk-benefit analysis about daylight. You take it away and people stop calculating and start reaching for weapons. He survived it. He always survives. But the moment is instructive about what his power actually requires. It requires that he never again be quite that explicit about what he is doing. It requires that the harm remains ambient and deniable rather than immediate and visible. The contaminated water is acceptable because it is invisible. The three-eyed fish is acceptable because it exists at a distance, in a river, in a context where the connection to daily life can be mediated by denial. The sun being gone is not acceptable because the sky is overhead and everyone has eyes, and the absence of daylight is something your body registers whether you want it to or not. Burns learned from this. Or rather, Burns has always known this, and the sun-blocking scheme was an exceptional case where his contempt for Springfield's population led him to overestimate the town's tolerance for visible harm. The lesson is that effective control does not look like control. It looks like natural order. It looks like things that have always been the way they are. It looks like cooling towers on the skyline that your eye has learned to skip over. That is why the contamination has been so effective as a control mechanism, because it is invisible, because it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, expressed in yellow skin that is just how people look in Springfield, in overbites that are just an aesthetic, in cognitive impairment that is just how Homer is. The harm does not announce itself. It integrates itself into the baseline of normal. And once something is normal, challenging it requires first doing the work of making it visible again, of pulling it out of the background where Burns has carefully placed it and holding it up in the light where people can see what it actually is. Lisa tries to do this over and over, episode after episode. She holds the contamination up in the light. She names the harm. She connects the dots. She writes the reports and submits them through the channels and stands up in front of adults who should know better and explains, With the particular patient clarity of a child who knows she is smarter than everyone in the room and is trying not to make them feel bad about it, what is happening in Springfield and what is causing it, and what should be done? And the adults nod, and the channels process her submissions. And the dots she connected are immediately disconnected again by the ambient weight of everything Burns has built to ensure that this specific kind of clarity never survives long enough to become action. That is what fear without fear looks like. Not the explicit threat, the invisible structure, the one your eye learns to skip over until it is just part of the landscape, as natural and unremarkable as a cooling tower against a Springfield sky. Part B. Burns and money. The specific arithmetic of unchecked wealth. Burns is a billionaire. The show establishes this in the first season and never meaningfully walks it back. He is a billionaire many times over, in possession of a fortune so large that the specific number has been estimated, revised, and debated across episodes without ever settling into anything fixed. What the show does establish with consistency is that Burns's wealth is not a number. It is a condition. It is the air in the room where every negotiation in Springfield takes place. Normal wealth, the kind that ordinary successful people accumulate, exists in a social context. It is recognized as significant. It grants advantages, it opens doors, but it also exists in relationship to other sources of wealth and other forms of power. A wealthy person in a normal community is wealthy relative to the people around them. They have more, not everything. Burns's wealth is different in kind, not just degree. Burns does not have more in a community where others also have. Burns has, and the community does not, in a way that creates a categorical difference between Burns and everyone else in Springfield, rather than a quantitative one. His wealth is not relative. It is absolute within Springfield's context. It is the difference between a man who has options and men who do not. Between a person who can absorb any consequence and people for whom consequences are final. This is the specific arithmetic that makes Burns's villainy possible in its particular form. He has never needed to operate through force because he has never been in a situation where force was the optimal tool. Force is expensive. In political and social terms, it creates martyrs. It generates the kind of direct, visible harm that might trigger exactly the kind of visceral community response that his structural dominance is designed to prevent. Burns does not need force because he has something better. He has the arithmetic of a situation in which every person who might challenge him is operating with a set of constraints that he does not share. He can wait, they cannot. He can absorb the cost of a prolonged legal challenge, they cannot. He can hire the best lawyers in any jurisdiction that might develop regulatory interest in his operations. They cannot afford comparable representation. He can fund the political campaigns of the officials who oversee his industry, they cannot. He can outlast any organized opposition simply by maintaining his financial position while the opposition exhausts its resources in the attempt to move something that has been designed not to move. This is the functional meaning of being too expensive to die, the phrase the show arrives at through the Burns immortality discussion. It is not only about the medical treatments, it is about the entire structure of Burns's relationship with consequence. He cannot be punished in the ways that punishment is designed to work, through loss. Every form of loss that functions as a deterrent for ordinary people, the loss of money, the loss of freedom, the loss of position, the loss of social standing, requires that the person being punished have something they cannot bear to lose. Burns has spent a century becoming a person whose net worth is so vast and whose social standing is so insulated and whose freedom is so thoroughly protected by institutional relationships that the standard repertoire of consequence simply does not reach him. The $56 million compliance estimate is the clearest number, $56 million to bring the plant into compliance. Burns's fortune, in various episodes, is estimated in the hundreds of billions. The compliance cost represents, by the most conservative estimate, a fraction of his total wealth. It is a rounding error in his balance sheet. It is an amount so trivial, relative to what he possesses, that refusing to pay it is not a financial decision at all. It is a statement. A declaration that the rules do not apply to him not because he cannot afford to comply with them, but because compliance would mean acknowledging that the rules have authority over him, and acknowledging that is something Burns has never been willing to do. This is the arithmetic of contempt. Burns could fix the plant tomorrow. He chose not to. He continues to choose not to. Every week that the plant operates with 342 uncorrected violations is a week of Burns making the same choice. Not because he has no alternative, because the alternative would cost him something other than money. It would cost him the image of a man above the rules. And that image is worth more to Burns than $56 million. It is worth more to him than the health of everyone in Springfield. It is worth more to him than the three-eyed fish in the river, and the luminous rats in the walls, and the skeletons in the basement and the children born into contamination. It is worth more to him than any of that because it is the foundation of everything else he has built. The image of untouchability. The demonstration, renewed every week through the ongoing operation of an illegal facility, that Burns exists in a category beyond consequence. The economics of Burns's relationship with Springfield also operate through a subtler mechanism than the obvious domination of the plant. Burns is the town's largest employer, but he is also, through a network of investments and institutional relationships that the show traces in fragments, embedded in the town's economic life at multiple levels. He is a creditor. He is a landlord, in the sense that the land beneath certain Springfield institutions has been in the Burns family for long enough that the current residents have forgotten the original transaction. He has positions in the businesses that supply the plant. He has relationships with the banks that provide capital for Springfield's local economy. When you are the largest employer, the largest creditor, the largest landowner, and the operator of the sole power plant in a small town, you are not operating within the town's economy. You are the town's economy. Your interests and the town's interests have been made identical through a series of investments and institutional relationships that have been building for decades. Challenging you is not a political act that might cost you money. It is an economic act that threatens the foundation of everyone's financial security. The banks cannot make loans in a community whose primary employer is under siege. The businesses that supply the plant cannot survive its shutdown. The workers who depend on their paychecks cannot pay their mortgages if the plant closes. Every thread of Burns's economic web connects to the same point: the continued operation of the arrangement as it currently exists. And Burns knows this. He has always known this. He built it, not through a single master plan drawn up in an evil boardroom. Through the accumulated effect of decades of strategic investment, each individual decision of which was unremarkable in isolation, in the normal course of a billionaire managing his holdings. But the cumulative effect, the total structure of what those individual decisions built, is a town whose every economic mechanism has been oriented toward the maintenance of Burns's position. There is also the longer time horizon that Burns's immortality provides. Most economic actors operate with a time horizon bounded by their own lifespan. You invest in things that will produce returns you will live to collect. You build relationships that will sustain you through the decades you have ahead of you. You plan strategically within the constraints of biological mortality. Burns does not have these constraints. He has been operating in Springfield for longer than most of its current residents have been alive. He has seen multiple generations of residents, of politicians, of business owners, of community leaders come and go. He has outlasted every challenge to his position, simply because challenges exhaust their human organizers, who age and die and pass away, and Burns is still there, still with his fingers steepled, still looking out the window. This temporal advantage is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of Burns's power. He does not need to defeat resistance. He only needs to outlast it, and he has been outlasting it for over a century. Every politician who campaigned against him is now dead. Every regulatory official who tried to force compliance is now dead. Every labor organizer who tried to build a union capable of meaningfully challenging plant conditions is now dead. Burns outlasted them all. He will outlast the current generation too. He will sit in his office and watch the people who might challenge him grow old and pass on, and be replaced by people who never knew the original terms of the arrangement, for whom the cooling towers are simply the skyline, and the three-eyed fish is simply the river, and the yellow skin is simply how people look in Springfield. The wealth and the immortality together create a form of invulnerability that no amount of moral outrage or organized resistance or legitimate regulatory challenge can penetrate. You cannot outlast something that does not die. You cannot exhaust something that has more resources than you can expend against it. You cannot organize effectively against something that can afford to wait you out, generation after generation. replacing the face of the opposition with fresh recruits who have to start the education process over from the beginning, while Burns sits in his office, unchanged, with his records intact and his memory unimpaired, and his weekly treatments keeping the machinery running. This is the final expression of what Burns's wealth actually is. Not a number, not a collection of assets, a form of time, the capacity to persist past the point where ordinary human beings can maintain their resistance. The capacity to outlast accountability itself, to sit in the same chair, looking out the same window, at the same town, while everyone who might have made things different has gone to whatever is on the other side of mortality, leaving behind them a Springfield that still has the cooling towers on the horizon, and the contaminated water in the pipes, and the three-eyed fish in the river, and Burns still there, at the window, waiting for the next generation to start figuring out what the previous generation also figured out and what Burns also outlasted. He will outlast this one too. Part C, the Burns mythology, what the show tells you without saying it. The Simpsons is a show that communicates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the surface level, the jokes, the characters, the situational comedy of a dysfunctional family navigating the absurdities of American life. There is the satirical level, the show's ongoing commentary on politics and media and culture, and the specific shape of American self-deception. And there is a third level, below both of those, that the show has never fully articulated but has been building for 3.5 decades in the background detail, in the callbacks and the continuity and the accumulated mythology. Burns operates primarily at the third level. His presence in individual episodes is often comedic, often absurdist, often deliberately reduced to a series of character notes, the inability to remember Homer's name, the fragile physicality, the archaic references, the steepled fingers. These surface notes are funny and they serve the comedy. But they are also the camouflage that allows the third level to operate without full acknowledgement. The Burns mythology, the deep structure of what the show has been building beneath the comedy, is a coherent narrative about the relationship between unchecked private power and collective well-being. It is not dressed up in political theory. It is not announced as commentary. It is expressed through the patient layering of specific, concrete, evidence-based detail across hundreds of episodes, building a picture so complete that when you step back far enough to see the whole thing, it is unmistakable. The picture is this. A very old, very wealthy man arrived in a small town a long time ago with enough capital to make himself structurally indispensable and enough patience to wait out every generation of opposition. He built a facility that provides a necessary service while causing cascading harm. He used the facility's economic centrality to insulate himself from accountability. He corrupted or neutralized every institution that might have checked him. He degraded the cognitive environment of the town through contamination so that the population's capacity to understand and resist his dominance was progressively diminished. He engineered the dependency of specific individuals through private arrangements that bound them to his interests against their own. He sustained himself through artificial means past the point where natural mortality would have ended his hold on power. And he did all of this in a town that the show depicts as somehow generic and universal, somehow representative of everywhere, somehow the town you grew up in. The universality is the key. The show did not set Burns in Springfield by accident. It set him in Springfield because Springfield is everywhere. Because the structure of what Burns has done to this town is not a cartoon fantasy. It is an accurate, if exaggerated, map of how unchecked wealth operates in communities that depend on its continued presence. The three-eyed fish is not only a gag about nuclear power. The three-eyed fish is the show's persistent, patient reminder that when a private enterprise operates without accountability in a community that cannot afford to challenge it, the community absorbs the consequences in its biology, in its children, in the specific shape of the next generation's health and cognition and capacity for understanding. The show has been making this argument for 36 years. Not in the satirical mode, not through explicit commentary, but through the faithful and detailed depiction of what happens in Springfield episode after episode after episode. The argument is visible in the character of Homer, whose cognitive decline is documented with a specificity that goes far beyond the demands of comedy. The argument is visible in Lisa, whose isolation maps exactly onto what happens to critical intelligence in a cognitive environment that has been systematically degraded. The argument is visible in Maggie, whose extraordinary capacity suggests the extreme end of what contamination does to biology when it goes the other way. The argument is visible in Ned Flanders, the most thoroughly punished character in a show that is ostensibly about consequences not sticking. Ned does everything right. He follows the rules. He maintains his ethics. He extends grace to people who do not deserve it. He goes to church and prays to the same God who has spoken directly to Homer on multiple occasions. And he gets nothing. His wife is killed. His house is destroyed. His faith is not answered. He is institutionalized for expressing feelings he was literally conditioned in childhood to suppress. Burns is the answer to why Ned is punished. The system does not reward goodness because the system is not designed to reward goodness. It is designed to maintain Burns. Burns at the top. Burns in possession of the plant. Burns with the weekly treatments and the steepled fingers and the name of the employee he has known for 30 years somewhere on the tip of his tongue, always just out of reach. The way everything he has taken from Springfield is just out of reach, somewhere below the surface, somewhere in the water, somewhere in the biology of the town he has made into the expression of his contempt. The mythology is coherent. It is complete. It has been built across 36 years of individual episodes that each contain a piece of it, and the pieces fit together with a precision that the show has never fully acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require the show to resolve it, and resolving it would mean either Burns loses or Springfield is destroyed in the loss of him, and neither of those is the show the audience has been watching. So the mythology persists. Burns persists. The cooling towers persist. The water persists. The fish with 3 eyes persist. And Springfield goes about its day, in the ambient haze of everything it has learned not to see, moving through a town that is also a symptom of a very old man's very old wound, waiting for something to change, knowing that it will not, because the show requires Burns the same way Springfield requires him. The loop holds, the system runs, and the outline of what it all adds up to is visible in every wide shot of the Springfield skyline. If you know what to look at. Part D. Every Burns episode revisited the show's complete villain archive. The catalog of Burns episodes is the longest, most detailed record of sustained villainy in animated television history. Let us move through some of the episodes that the overview treatments of Burns most often skip, the ones that do not make the highlight reels, that exist in the middle seasons and the later runs where the show's mythology is still accumulating even as the headlines have gone elsewhere. There is the episode where Burns learns he is dying. Not the weekly medical maintenance kind of dying, a specific, diagnosed, terminal condition. The doctors at one point inform him, in that famous scene, that he has every disease known to medical science, but they exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. But across other episodes, the show returns to Burns's health in ways that suggest the equilibrium is imperfect and occasionally threatening. And in the episode where Burns believes he has a specific, final, irreversible condition, his response is revealing. He does not become generous. He does not experience a conversion. He does not look at Springfield, the community he has spent decades poisoning and dominating, and feel moved to make reparations. He becomes furious. Furious in the specific way of a man who has organized his entire life around the project of not being subject to normal human limitations, who has built treatments and wealth and institutional infrastructure specifically to prevent exactly this outcome, and who cannot process the idea that the outcome might arrive anyway. His mortality, briefly confronted, does not produce wisdom. It produces rage. The rage of a man who has been running from the implications of being a person for so long that being reminded of his personhood feels like an attack, and then the diagnosis is revised. The equilibrium reasserts itself. Burns does not die. The moment passes. The way he handles that moment, the fury rather than the reflection, the rage rather than the reckoning, tells you something fundamental about why Burns will never change. Change requires the kind of honest self-accounting that Burns's entire psychological structure is designed to prevent. He cannot look at what he has done to Springfield and feel moved to make it right, because looking at it would require being the kind of person who can be moved. The conditioning he underwent, willingly, over a lifetime, the building of walls, the replacement of feeling with calculation, the systematic elimination of the vulnerability that made Bobo's loss so devastating, has produced exactly what it was intended to produce. A man who cannot be reached, who cannot be moved, who can only be managed, outlasted, or, theoretically, removed. Nobody removes him. The show does not permit it. And so, the moment of almost reckoning passes like all the others. Burns closes back up, the walls go back up, the calculation reassumes its throne, and Springfield goes on. There are the episodes where Burns's specific historical memories are deployed as character notes, the references to the Gilded Age as personal experience, the mention of Theodore Roosevelt, the stories about Howard Hughes, the Yale attendance and the World War II service, and the century of accumulated personal history that the show uses partly for comedy, the anachronism of his references in a contemporary context, and partly to establish the temporal scale of his power. Burns has been doing this for a very long time. Every institution in Springfield has grown up in his shadow. Every generation of Springfield's political and civic life has developed in an environment he shaped. The current generation of residents was born into a context Burns built. Their parents were born into a context Burns was already in the process of building. Their grandparents lived through the period when the plant was being established and the contamination was beginning. The show shows you this through the aging of side characters. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, is the generation that made the original accommodation. He is the generation that worked for Burns or alongside Burns, that made the deals and kept the silences and participated in the construction of the arrangement that the current generation inhabits. Abe is complicit, but Abe is also the most vivid embodiment of what Burns's dominance costs across a lifetime. He is an old man in a retirement home. His memories are unreliable. His relationship with his son is defined by distance and miscommunication, and the accumulated weight of the things he never said, the deal he never explained, the history he never shared. He is sitting in the Springfield retirement castle, watching television, in a building that was nearly destroyed by Burns's sinkhole-producing oil extraction, in a room that runs on electricity from Burns's plant, sustained by a medical system in a community that Burns's contamination has shaped from the foundations up. That is what Burns's arithmetic looks like at the end of a life. An old man in a retirement home, watching television, in the house that Burns's system built. Not dramatically, just there, present in the quietest possible expression of what a century of unchallenged power does to the people who live alongside it. The Burns-Smithers relationship deserves an entire volume of its own, but let us spend some time with the specific dynamic in the episodes where Burns's dependence on Smithers is most visible. There are episodes where Smithers is temporarily absent, for one reason or another, where Burns must navigate some ordinary aspect of daily existence without Smithers's management. These episodes are funny in the obvious comedic sense. Burns unable to figure out how to operate a microwave, Burns lost in a part of his own facility he has never personally visited. But they are also something else. They are documentation of a dependency so total that the person at the center of it has no functional identity outside the relationship. Burns is not simply a man who relies on Smithers for professional support. He is a man who has offloaded so many basic functions of daily life onto Smithers that his independent existence is genuinely compromised. The Smithers relationship is, on one level, the show's most persistent expression of Burns's underlying vulnerability. Strip away the wealth and the institutional power and the immortality treatments, and what you find is a man who cannot take care of himself. Who built an empire in part to surround himself with the infrastructure that allows him to not take care of himself? Who keeps Smithers in a permanent state of devoted dependency? Because the alternative, being genuinely alone, without the one person who manages the things that keep him alive and functional, is more terrifying to Burns than any external threat. This is the Bobo wound expressed in structural terms. The child who lost the bear and decided never to be vulnerable again built a life in which the mechanisms of dependence were externalized and professionalized and made as controllable as possible. He does not love Smithers the way a person who allows themselves to feel things loves a person. He needs Smithers in the way that a body needs a heart. And knowing that he needs Smithers produces not gratitude or tenderness, but the specific, cold anxiety of a person who has identified a vulnerability in their own architecture and cannot figure out how to eliminate it. He manages it by keeping Smithers in the loop of unrequited devotion, by giving Smithers just enough proximity and just enough purpose to maintain the devotion without ever giving Smithers the power that genuine reciprocity would create. It is, like everything Burns does, elegant, terrible, and completely insulated from the consequences it deserves. The final category of Burns episodes that deserves attention is the rare episode where Burns is genuinely defeated, where something works against him. Where the cartoon logic of justice, temporary and unreliable as it is in Springfield, produces a moment in which Burns is on the receiving end of consequence. These moments are always temporary. They do not stick. The defeat of one episode does not carry into the next. Burns is not changed by them, not humbled by them, not made more cautious by them. He absorbs them with the specific patience of a very old man who has been defeated many times before and has outlasted every defeat. But they are worth cataloging because they represent the show's occasional acknowledgement that resistance is possible, that the structure Burns has built, however comprehensive, has gaps, that a town with enough rage can briefly pierce the insulation, that even Smithers, the most reliable component of Burns's infrastructure, has a line, that the equipment has failures, that the three-eyed fish, improbably, is still alive and still in the river, carrying in its biology the evidence of what Burns has done, available to anyone who wants to pull it out of the water and look at it clearly. The defeats do not stick, but they happened. They are in the record. And the record, across 36 seasons of carefully accumulated detail, is the most thorough accounting of a single fictional villain's sustained harm against a community that American television has ever produced. It is the accounting Burns has never had to give in the show's universe. We just gave it here. Part E. What Burns would say in his own defense. There is a version of Burns's perspective that the show occasionally surfaces. Not an apology, not an explanation, an argument. A worldview expressed in the specific terms of a man who has never needed to defend himself to anyone who had the power to hold him accountable, and who therefore has developed his defense in the abstract for his own use, as the internal justification that allows the system to continue running without the friction of doubt. Burns would argue that he provides. The town has electricity because of him. The workers have employment because of him. The tax base that funds whatever public services Springfield manages to provide is generated in significant part by the operation of the plant. Without Burns, the lights go out. The jobs disappear. The economic basis for the community dissolves. He provides, and providers, in his philosophy, are entitled to the terms they set. The contractor sets the terms of the contract. The provider sets the terms of the provision. Springfield wants electricity and employment and economic stability, and Burns has those things and has always been willing to offer them, and the terms he has set in exchange are simply the terms of the deal. The three-eyed fish is not a crime. It is a line item. The contamination is not murder. It is overhead. This is the argument. It is coherent. It has a logic. It is the logic of every industrialist who has ever externalized the cost of their operations onto a community that could not refuse the terms, dressed up in the language of provision and employment and economic necessity. It is the logic that makes the $56 million compliance estimate feel, from Burns's perspective, like extortion rather than justice. He is providing a service. The service has costs. The costs are distributed among the parties closest to the production. That is how it works. What the argument misses, what the argument is specifically designed to miss, is that the community did not negotiate the terms. Springfield did not sit across a table from Burns and agree to accept contaminated water and a compromised political system and a cognitively impaired workforce in exchange for electricity and employment. The terms were not negotiated. They were established through the construction of dependency before the community understood what it was agreeing to. Springfield needed electricity. Burns had the plant. The deal was signed in the structure of the situation rather than in any formal exchange of terms. A deal signed in the structure of a situation that one party engineered is not a deal. It is a fait accompli. It is the conclusion of a process of entrapment that was completed before the trapped party understood the shape of what it was inside. Burns would not acknowledge this. His argument requires the fiction that Springfield had options and chose this one. The options it had were real, technically. The town could have declined to build its economic life around the plant. It could have developed alternative energy sources. It could have built an economy less dependent on a single large employer. All of these were theoretically available at the moment when the arrangement was being established. But Burns arrived in Springfield with the capital and the planning and the institutional connections that a small town in the process of making economic decisions simply did not have. The options available to Springfield were the options that existed in a context Burns was already shaping. That is not a negotiation between equals. That is the application of superior leverage by a party who has spent a century learning exactly how to apply it. He would not acknowledge any of this, but it is there, in the water, in the fish, in the children's eyes, and Springfield has been drinking it for 36 years. Part F. The closing meditation, what 3.5 decades of Burns actually means. Something remarkable has happened over the course of this video. We have followed Charles Montgomery Burns through 36 years of a television show and arrived at a portrait that feels, despite its cartoon origins, disturbingly accurate. Not accurate in the sense that Burns exists. Accurate in the sense that what he represents exists. The specific form of harm he embodies, the specific mechanics of his power, the specific way his wealth and longevity and institutional reach combine to produce a community that cannot protect itself from him, all of that has real-world analogs. All of that maps onto actual structures that actual communities have confronted and sometimes could not defeat. The show knew this. The writers of The Simpsons, many of them graduates of elite institutions with backgrounds in social science and political theory and economics, built Burns with a precision that goes beyond character comedy. They built him as a diagnostic instrument, as a way of making visible, through exaggeration and animation, something that is harder to see when it is dressed in the ordinary clothes of real-world corporate power. They made him ancient and fragile and faintly absurd so that you would keep watching. And in the background of the watching, they built the case. Evidence by evidence, violation by violation, deal by deal, contamination by contamination, generation by generation. The case is complete. It has been complete for a while. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is the town. The mechanism is the plant. The perpetrator is the man in the office at the top, with the steepled fingers and the bad memory for names and the weekly appointments that keep him functional, and the complete and total absence of anything that functions in him the way a conscience functions in people who have not spent a century building walls against the possibility of feeling responsible for anything. Burns is still at the window. Springfield is still below him. The cooling towers are still on the skyline. The fish in the river has 3 eyes, and the fish does not know it is a clue. The water in the tap has what the water has, and the people who drink it do not know what they are drinking. The children in Springfield Elementary carry in their biology the record of everything that happened to their parents and their grandparents and the town before them, and they go to school in a building whose budget was gutted by the extraction of oil from beneath its foundations, and they sit in classrooms and try to learn, and some of them cannot sit still, and some of them play saxophone alone, and one of them is behind a pacifier watching everything and waiting. Burns looks out the window. Burns steeples his fingers. Burns is not thinking about any of them. Burns is thinking about the quarterly figures and the next treatment and the arrangement that keeps the arrangement running. The self-sustaining loop that he built and maintains and lives inside and will continue to maintain as long as the treatments hold, and Smithers keeps the appointments, and Springfield keeps the lights on, and the fish in the river grows. Its third eye in the dark water downstream of the plant. And nobody thinks too hard about why. That is the show, that is Burns, that is Springfield, and it is time, finally, quietly, after all of this, to let the town settle back into the comfortable unreality of a cartoon and remember that you are watching from somewhere else. Somewhere with its own skyline and its own water and its own structures of power that you probably do not think about very much. And maybe, tonight, that is fine. Maybe tonight you just let the cooling towers be fictional and the fish be a cartoon and the old man in the office be a character rather than a mirror. Maybe tonight you just let Springfield be Springfield. It will all still be there in the morning. It always is. End of expansion sections. Final expansion. The complete Burns evidence file. Part G. Every season, every Burns a tour through the evidence. The case against Burns is not built in a single dramatic revelation. It is assembled the way all the most durable cases are assembled, slowly, methodically, episode by episode, season by season, across the full run of a show that has been placing evidence in front of its audience for 36 years. Let us walk through the seasons and the specific moments the case is built from. Season 1 establishes Burns as the employer. The early characterization is relatively simple. A billionaire who cannot remember his employee's name. A man of cartoon villainy in the most conventional sense. The show has not yet fully committed to the architecture of what it will build around him. But even here, in the first season, the structural elements are being put in place. Burns's power over Homer is absolute. Homer's tenure is precarious. The plant's conditions are already being presented as substandard in ways that the show plays for comedy, but that carry, if you look at them straight, a specific quality of documented harm. The early episodes are establishing the baseline. This is what normal looks like in Springfield. This is the starting point from which the accumulation of evidence will build. Season 2 gives you Blinky, the three-eyed fish. The episode that makes the environmental argument as explicit as the show will ever be willing to make it, then retreats behind the comedy of Burns eating the fish at dinner and the candidate losing and everything returning to normal. But Blinky is in the record now. The three-eyed fish is in the river, and it is in the show's mythology, permanently, available to be picked up by anyone who wants to examine what it means. The show planted the seed in Season 2, and it has been growing in the background of every season since. Season 3 and 4 represent the years when the show is at its most emotionally grounded, its most domestic, its most focused on the family's interior life, rather than the broader Springfield mythology. These are the seasons where the Burns character is most often a peripheral presence, where his role is to create workplace obstacles for Homer, rather than to drive overarching story. But this period is also, if the coma theory has any weight, the last period before the show's tonal shift, and the Burns presence during these seasons carries a different quality in retrospect. Less the architect of a decades-long contamination, and more the specific personal tormentor of one family. The man who does not remember Homer's name, who humiliates Homer publicly, who threatens Homer's livelihood in casual, thoughtless ways. These are the years when Burns's personal cruelty toward the Simpson family is most domestic and most immediate, and they create the foundation for everything the show will later reveal about the structural depth of that cruelty. Season 5 through 7 represents the period when the show begins to open up the Burns mythology in earnest. The Springfield Files episode gives you Burns's medical treatments and the glowing alien in the woods. The Mother Simpson episode gives you the biological weapons lab and Mona's exile, and the full architecture of Burns's relationship with the Simpson family across generations. The Who Shot Mr. Burns two-parter gives you the sun-blocking scheme and its consequences. These are the seasons when the show is doing its most ambitious work with Burns as a character, when it is connecting the individual episodes to something larger, when it is building the case in a way that goes beyond character comedy into something that functions as genuine narrative about power and harm. The Mother Simpson episode deserves more time than it typically gets in Burns discussions, because it is the most complete single-episode presentation of the case against him. Everything is there. The biological weapons facility, the activist who tried to stop it, the pursuit that lasted decades, the family that was broken apart, the son who grew up without his mother and became the safety inspector at the facility his mother tried to destroy, the reunion that Burns's recognition of Mona cut short. All in one episode, all presented with an emotional honesty that the show's comedic register rarely permits. The episode ends with Homer sitting on the car hood, looking at the sky, in a moment of quiet devastation that does not resolve and does not reach for a laugh and does not pretend that what happened was okay. The Who Shot Mr. Burns episodes are the most famous, the most discussed, the most analyzed. But the analysis has almost always focused on the mystery rather than the context. Who shot Burns? Not what Burns had done to earn it. The show spent part 1 establishing the full catalog of Burns's recent crimes. The school's oil well, the retirement home, the tavern, the dog, the sun itself. And then the shooting transformed the story into a whodunit, and the catalog of crimes became the backdrop for the mystery rather than the main event. The main event was always the catalog. The shooting was the town's response to it. Whoever pulled the trigger, and we have examined the evidence for multiple candidates in separate discussions, was expressing in physical form what every person in that town meeting had felt and suppressed and continued to suppress in the years and decades before that night. The shooting was Springfield's one moment of genuine, unmediated response to what Burns had been doing. The show turned it into a puzzle, and in doing so, it did what Springfield always does. It redirected attention away from the crime and toward the consequence, away from what Burns had done and toward who had done something to Burns. Season 8 through 12 represents the period when the Burns character begins to stabilize into something more mythological. The early seasons established his dominance. The middle seasons built the mythology. This period begins to treat Burns as a fixture, an institution in himself, as permanent and unremarkable as the cooling towers. His appearances become more reliable for specific character notes and less likely to generate new additions to the mythology. He is, by this point in the show's run, already the most comprehensively documented villain in its history. The show does not need to build new dimensions of his villainy. It needs only to maintain his presence as the architectural fact of Springfield's existence that he has become. But even in this period, the accumulation continues. Burns's immortality becomes more explicit. His medical treatments become more central to his characterization. The Three Stooges syndrome scene, one of the show's most quoted medical moments, arrives in this period and does the work of making his survival seem both comic and genuinely biological. The episodes that deal with his family history, with the Burns dynasty and its centuries of accumulated wealth and power, arrive in this period and deepen the temporal scale of what he represents. He is not just a contemporary villain. He is the most recent iteration of something that has been operating for a very long time. The later seasons are where the Burns mythology sometimes loses its coherence, not through any failure of ambition, but through the natural entropy of a show running for this long, with this many writers and this many episodes. But even in the later seasons, the core evidence is still being added to. The Homer confession in season 18, the throwaway line about Homer having shot Burns, arrives in a period when the show is no longer doing its most careful narrative work. But the line is there, in the record, waiting to be connected to everything that came before it, and the children are still yellow. The fish still has 3 eyes, the plant still has the cracked cooling towers, the water still carries whatever the water carries. Burns is still at the window. The seasons accumulate, the evidence accumulates. The case gets more complete with every episode, and Burns gets more invulnerable with every passing year. And Springfield gets no closer to accountability because the show does not permit it. And the show does not permit it because Springfield does not permit it, and Springfield does not permit it, because Burns has ensured that the conditions for accountability have never fully developed. The record stands. 36 seasons of it. Every three-eyed fish, every luminous rat, every skeleton in the basement, every plutonium paperweight, every cracked cooling tower patched with chewing gum, every deal made in silence, every mother driven underground, every safety violation documented and ignored, every child born yellow into a yellow town that has forgotten it was not always yellow. The record stands. Part H. Ned Flanders and the ethics of proximity to Burns. We have spoken about Burns at length. We have examined his direct victims, Homer, Mona, the town as a whole, the children, Smithers. But there is one character whose relationship to Burns is almost entirely structural rather than direct, and that structural relationship tells you something important about how Burns's presence in Springfield reshapes the ethical landscape for everyone who lives there, not only the people he has directly harmed. Ned Flanders is Burns's moral counterpoint. The show positions them as opposites in every dimension. Burns is old, physically failing, morally bankrupt, supported by artificial means, corrupted by a century of unchecked power. Ned is relatively young, physically exceptional, morally rigorous, supported by genuine faith, committed to principles he has maintained across 36 years of being comprehensively punished for maintaining them. Burns has everything. Ned has almost nothing in the material sense that Burns does not occasionally reach in and take from him. Ma was killed because of Homer, who works for Burns. The house was destroyed by a storm that the show implies was worsened by the environmental conditions Burns's plant has created. The school lost its funding because of the oil well Burns drilled beneath it, which affected the educational environment of Ned's children, Rod and Todd, as directly as it affected the Simpsons. Ned's proximity to Burns is not the proximity of the employee or the contaminated resident or the political subject. It is the proximity of a man who is committed to living ethically in an environment that a system of unchecked power has made ethical living extraordinarily costly. Every time Ned extends grace to Homer, he is extending grace to the person most closely associated with the system that keeps costing him. Every time Ned goes to church and prays to a God who speaks to Homer but not to Ned, he is performing his faith in the context of a town where faith is demonstrably unrewarded in ways that cannot be explained by theology alone. The show has a thesis about Ned that it never quite states directly. Ned represents the person who tries to live right inside a system that is not designed to reward rightness. His suffering is not the result of his failures. It is the result of his successes, his genuine, sustained commitment to the ethical life, expressed in an environment that Burns has made inhospitable to exactly that commitment. Because Burns's system does not punish wrongness. It rewards compliance. Homer, who does everything wrong by the standards Ned applies to himself, survives and thrives in the specific, limited way that the system requires, because Homer is compliant. He does not challenge the plant. He does not organize. He does not ask questions that would threaten the arrangement. He absorbs his salary and his contamination and his cognitive impairment and his complicity, and he goes home and strangles his son and watches television, and that is sufficient. The system keeps him employed. The deal keeps him protected. The arrangement sustains him. Ned does not receive the same protection because Ned is not the same kind of asset. Burns needs Homer. Burns has no use for Ned. A man of principle who lives next door to Homer and might, if given the right information and the right circumstances, provide Homer with the perspective that Homer lacks, is not useful to Burns. He is, if anything, a potential complication. A person who might notice things and say things and whose ethical commitment might produce the kind of witness that a system like Burns's prefers not to have in close proximity. The show does not articulate it this way. Ned's suffering is not the result of Burns's direct targeting of him. But it is the result of Burns's system operating in the only way it knows how, rewarding the compliant and neglecting, occasionally punishing, the people who insist on living by standards the system did not set and does not endorse. Ned keeps praying. God keeps not answering. Homer keeps surviving. The gap between them never closes. Part I. Springfield after Burns. What the town would look like without him. The show will never give us this. But let us spend some time with the imagination of it. What would Springfield look like if Burns were removed? Not killed, necessarily, though that is one possibility. Simply removed. The plant transferred to another ownership structure, or closed, or remediated or converted. Burns's institutional web dismantled. His political relationships dissolved. His economic dominance broken. The immediate period would be catastrophic. That much is not controversial. The economic dependency that Burns has built is real, and real dependencies produce real crises when they are suddenly removed. Workers would lose employment. The town's electricity supply would require restructuring. The businesses and institutions that have built themselves around the plant's economic output would face genuine disruption. There would be pain, serious, immediate, unavoidable pain. But underneath that pain, if you could sustain the imagination far enough forward, something else might begin to emerge. The contamination of the water supply, without the plant operating, would begin to clear, slowly, over years and decades, because contamination of the kind the plant has produced does not reverse quickly. But it would begin to reverse. The biological pressure on Springfield's population, the radiation exposure, the neurological impairment, would begin to reduce. The mutations would begin to stabilize, then to fade, across generations, as bodies born into a cleaner environment expressed different biology than the ones born under the cooling towers. The cognitive environment would change, not immediately, not in the generation that has already absorbed the contamination, but in the generation after that. Children born in a Springfield without the plant's output would have access to neurological function that their parents and grandparents did not. They would be able to think more clearly, to hold contradictions in mind more effectively, to ask the questions that the town has been unable to ask for decades. The specific, particular, deliberately maintained stupidity that Burns's system requires of its subjects would begin to lift. And then other things might become possible. The political accountability that has always been structurally impossible might begin to find traction. The institutional capture that Burns's wealth and longevity sustained might begin to unravel as the wealth and longevity are no longer providing their inputs. The deals made in silence, The Abe arrangements and the Wiggum compromises and the editorial decisions and the judicial decrees might begin to feel less binding as the power that enforced them is no longer present to ensure they hold. Springfield without Burns is a town with a very long, very painful, very slow recovery ahead of it. A town that would have to do the work, genuinely and collectively and over generations, of undoing the effects of what was done to it. The water remediation, the institutional reform, the educational investment, the neurological recovery of a population whose cognitive function has been systematically degraded. None of it would be quick or easy or cheap. None of it would be anything other than hard. But it might, finally, be possible. Lisa would finally be heard. Not immediately, not in a single generation, but eventually in a Springfield where the ambient cognitive impairment is lifting, where the water is cleaner and the air is clearer, and the children being born do not carry the same contamination load their parents carried. Lisa might find an audience. She might find interlocutors. The town might, over time, produce people capable of following what she is saying and responding to it and building on it in the way that genuine intellectual engagement works when the participants are not cognitively compromised by their water supply. Maggie would speak. What she would say is the show's greatest unrealized mystery. But in a Springfield not organized around Burns's need for her silence, for the silence of everyone who understands too much, Maggie might finally find a reason to talk. And whatever she has been carrying behind that pacifier, whatever 36 years of watching everything while saying nothing has produced in that extraordinary mind, might finally enter the world. Homer might not recover. The damage is too old and too deep. But Homer's children might. The next generation, born into a Springfield that no longer has Burns at its center, might carry a lighter inheritance. They might be the version of what the Simpson family could have been without the century of engineering Burns performed on their conditions. This is the imagination. The show will never give it to us. The show requires Burns the same way Springfield requires him, economically and narratively, as the organizing principle around which everything else arranges itself. Remove Burns and you do not have the show. You have the aftermath of the show. A different story, slower and less dramatic and less funny, and more honest about what recovery from this kind of sustained institutional harm actually requires. The show does not want to tell that story. Springfield cannot tell that story. Burns is too central, too necessary, too embedded for his removal to produce anything other than chaos that the show cannot contain within its episodic format. So Burns stays. So the plant stays. So the cooling towers stay on the skyline. So the water keeps coming out of the tap with whatever it has in it. So the fish in the river lives its three-eyed life in the dark water downstream, and the children keep being born yellow, and the principal keeps being someone other than who he says he is, and Homer keeps going to work, and Ned keeps going to church, and Maggie keeps watching from behind her. Pacifier. The loop holds. It has always held. It will keep holding for as long as the show runs, which is to say, by current evidence, forever. Burns at the window. Springfield below. The most comprehensive, most patient, most thoroughly documented villain in American television history. Still there, still at the window, still calculating, and Springfield goes about its day. Part J. The complete Burns inventory, everything he has taken. This is the inventory, not a summary, the actual list. Everything the evidence supports. Everything the show has documented across 36 seasons that can be attributed to Charles Montgomery Burns, to his decisions, to his negligence, to his deals, to his systematic destruction of every accountability mechanism that might have stopped him. He took Mona Simpson from her son. He did this by running a biological weapons laboratory in her town and then using his political connections to make her a federal fugitive when she tried to stop him. He sustained the pursuit for 27 years. He recognized her through a taxi window 3 decades after the original crime and made the call that sent her running again. He outlived her. The son she could not raise grew up believing he was abandoned. He took Homer's potential. The man Homer could have been, the man who existed briefly when the crayon was removed, when the radiation damage was temporarily circumvented, was a different person. Articulate, capable, able to understand the world around him at the level its complexity requires. Burns took that person through 3 separate mechanisms simultaneously. The radiation from the plant, The deal with Abe that placed Homer in the plant? The original crime that sent Mona away and shaped Homer's psychology into the specific, desperate, approval-seeking form that made him the ideal compliant employee. He took the school's funding. The oil well beneath Springfield Elementary was the school's. The extraction collapsed the budget. The music program was cut. The educational environment became worse. The children who needed it most received less. Tito Puente lost his job. Lisa lost resources she was already not getting enough of. He took the retirement home's land. The sinkhole from his extraction operations threatened the foundations of the Springfield retirement castle. He took the land beneath the people who had used up their working lives and were living out their remaining years in the only institution available to them. He took Moe's livelihood. The specific mechanism of Moe's financial destruction in the run-up to the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline is directly attributable to Burns's activities. Moe lost his bar, a small business, a community gathering place, a piece of Springfield's social fabric, was destroyed by the economic ripples of Burns's actions. He took Smithers's life. Not literally, but functionally. Smithers has given his entire existence to the management of Burns's, and Burns has never once acknowledged that the gift was worth receiving. Every year of Smithers's life that was spent managing Burns's appointments and anticipating Burns's needs, and suppressing his own desires in service of a man who regards him as a useful piece of infrastructure, is a year that Smithers did not spend on anything else. The mathematics of a life given and not received. He took the sun, not permanently, but he built the machine. He positioned the disk. He made Springfield dark. He looked at a town and decided that its access to daylight was a negotiating chip. The arrogance of that is worth sitting with for a moment. Burns looked at the sun over Springfield and saw leverage. He took the fish's eye, or added one. The three-eyed fish in the river is the most persistent symbol of what Burns has done to the living environment of Springfield. Every organism in the watershed is a blinky. The fish is just the most visible one, the most photogenic, the most useful as evidence. But the contamination is not selective. It does not distinguish between fish and birds and mammals and the humans who drink from the same river that produces three-eyed fish. He took the children's neurological futures. The children born in Springfield, born to parents who had been absorbing the plant's contamination, carry in their developmental profiles the evidence of what was in the water when they were formed. They carry it in their impulsivity and their attention regulation, and their specific, particular difficulties with the kind of sustained analytical thinking that a contaminated neurological environment makes harder. They do not know this is what they carry. They think it is just who they are. He took the town's ability to see itself. The cognitive impairment that the contamination has produced is most devastating, not in its immediate effects, but in its meta-effect. A population that cannot think clearly about why it cannot think clearly. The contamination has affected the very faculties that might be used to assess the contamination. It is recursive. It is self-sustaining. And it is the most elegant piece of Burns's control architecture because it requires no maintenance. The damage does the work of preventing its own recognition. He took the institutional integrity of every public body in Springfield, the police department that does not investigate the plant, the judiciary that criminalizes truth, the media that covers the town without covering what the town is built on, the medical establishment that treats symptoms without connecting them to causes. Each of these institutions is less than it should be because of what Burns has done to the civic environment they operate in. He has not only corrupted them actively, though he has done that, he has contaminated the environment in which they function so thoroughly that functional public institutions cannot develop there. He took the town's future. Every year that the plant continues to operate in its current condition, every year of continued contamination and continued cognitive degradation and continued institutional dysfunction, is a year of Springfield's potential that Burns has claimed for himself and converted into profit. The future that Springfield might have built, the community it might have become if its economic life had developed around different foundations, is not available. It was foreclosed by the construction of the dependency, and the dependency was built before the town understood what it was agreeing to. This is the inventory, not complete. The full inventory would require cataloging every three-eyed fish and every luminous rat and every cracked cooling tower and every plutonium paperweight and every skeleton in the basement and every deal made in silence and every Election where Burns's preferred outcome prevailed, and every regulatory inspection that produced a violation count, and no consequence. The full inventory would take longer than the show has been running. But this is the outline, the shape of it. The accumulated weight of what one man, sustained by extraordinary wealth and artificial longevity, and the systematic corruption of every accountability mechanism in his sphere, can take from a community that has no structural capacity to stop him. He is still at the window. Springfield is still below him. The inventory is still growing, one episode at a time. Good night, Springfield. The plant is still running. End of final expansion sections. Additional expansion, the weight of evidence. Part K. The deal that made everything possible. Revisiting the Abe Burns arrangement. The deal between Abraham Simpson and Charles Montgomery Burns is the fulcrum on which the entire structure of Homer's life balances. It is the moment where the personal and the institutional intersect most completely, where the macro story of Burns's dominance over Springfield and the micro story of the Simpson family's specific suffering become the same story. Let us give this deal the attention it deserves. Because the commentary on it tends to move through it quickly, to use it as a plot point that explains Homer's seemingly inexplicable job security, and then to move on. But the deal is not primarily a plot device. It is the clearest evidence in the show's entire canon of how Burns's power operates at the individual human level, not through schemes, not through institutional capture, through the specific, personal, intimate corruption of individual people who have something to protect and who are offered the chance to protect it at a price they are willing to pay, even though the price is the town's safety. Abe Simpson had evidence. Real evidence. The kind that, in a functional accountability environment, might have meant something, might have led to a conversation about the crime Burns committed, might have led to transparency, to consequence, to some version of accountability, however incomplete. Abe made the deal. He accepted Burns's terms and he protected his son, or he thought he was protecting his son, because the deal he struck did not actually protect Homer from the plant. It placed Homer inside the plant. It guaranteed Homer's employment within the facility, whose operations Abe had the evidence to challenge and chose not to challenge. The protection was real in one narrow sense. Homer would have a job. Homer would not be economically precarious. Homer would have the stability that Abe, perhaps, felt he had failed to provide in other dimensions of Homer's life. But the job was in the plant. The security was in the contaminated environment. The stability was inside the walls of the facility that was poisoning the town. Abe protected Homer from economic uncertainty by delivering him to environmental and neurological and psychological harm. Not because Abe was malicious, because Abe could not see, in the moment of the deal, the full architecture of what he was agreeing to. He saw the immediate threat, Homer's economic vulnerability, and he addressed it with the tools available, Burns's offer of guaranteed employment. He did not see the longer-term harm, because the longer-term harm was not visible in the way that economic precarity is visible. This is precisely how Burns operates. He presents people with visible, immediate threats and offers to address them in exchange for the cooperation that sustains his system. The threat is real. The offer is real. The exchange appears to be in both parties' interests. And the harm that the exchange sustains, the environmental contamination, the political corruption, the institutional dysfunction, is distributed over time and space in ways that are much harder to connect to the specific transaction. Abe made the best deal available to him in the moment he understood his options, and in doing so, he built the foundation of his son's 36 years of employment in a facility that is slowly dismantling Homer's neurology. The deal's aftermath is what makes it genuinely tragic. Homer never knew about it. Homer went to work at the plant, was kept on through 742 documented errors, survived every incident that should have produced his termination, and interpreted this survival as evidence of his own resilience or his employer's indifference or some combination of both. He never knew that his father had purchased this outcome. He never knew the price. He never knew that his grandfather's silence about a crime he witnessed was the thing standing between Homer and unemployment. And because Homer did not know, he could not make the connection that would require him to act on the knowledge. He could not look at his employment and see the deal that shaped it, and follow that deal back to Burns and forward to his mother, and understand in full that the man signing his paychecks is the man who broke his family and has been living off the silence that breaking it required. Homer was protected from this knowledge, and the protection was part of the deal, not explicitly. Not through a clause in the arrangement that specified Homer must remain ignorant, but through the natural consequence of keeping the deal secret, which is that the people most affected by it could not navigate around its consequences because they did not know those consequences had a cause. This is the most insidious form of Burns's harm. Not the harm you can see, not the three-eyed fish or the cracked cooling towers or the skeletons in the basement, the harm that lives in the architecture of not knowing, in the specific shape of ignorance that has been carefully maintained, because the knowledge would be more dangerous to the arrangement than the ignorance is to the people inside it. Homer is inside the arrangement, has always been inside it, was placed inside it by a deal made before he was old enough to understand that deals were being made about him, and he will stay inside it, working his shift in Sector 7G, eating his donuts, occasionally causing nuclear incidents, going home at 5:30, as long as the arrangement holds. The arrangement holds. Part L, Mr. Burns and the Nature of Evil. What the show is really arguing. We have been talking about Burns for a long time. We have followed the evidence through 36 seasons and arrived at a portrait that is, in its accumulated detail, genuinely comprehensive. But there is one more thing to say about Burns that all the specific evidence points toward, and that constitutes, when you hear it stated directly, the show's deepest and most uncomfortable thesis. Burns is not exceptional, that is the claim. Not that his specific actions are ordinary. They are not ordinary. No one else in American television fiction has blocked out the sun over an entire town, or run a private biological weapons facility, or contaminated a water supply for decades while buying the silence of every accountability mechanism available. The specific actions are extreme, but the logic that produces them is not exceptional. It is the logic of unchecked private power applied to a dependent community over a sufficient length of time. It is what happens when the normal constraints on how much one person can take from a shared environment are absent. When the economic dependency is complete, when the institutional oversight has been captured, when the cognitive environment has been degraded enough that meaningful resistance becomes structurally impossible, when the person at the center of the arrangement has lived long enough to outlast every specific challenge and has resources sufficient to absorb every specific consequence, remove the cartoon exaggeration. Remove the glowing alien appearance and the three-eyed fish and the sun-blocking machine and the immortality treatments. Strip the Burns scenario down to its structural elements: private monopoly control of a critical resource, economic dependency of a population with no meaningful alternatives, systematic capture of regulatory and political oversight, contamination of shared resources without accountability, suppression of community capacity for critical assessment through the degradation of the shared cognitive environment. Those structural elements are not fictional. They are the description of how certain forms of concentrated private power actually operate in actual communities. The fish has three eyes because it is a cartoon. The mechanism that produced the fish is not a cartoon. The mechanism is a recognizable pattern in the real history of industrial communities and their relationship to the concentrated private power that dominates their economic life. The Simpsons has been making this argument, through Burns, for 36 years. Not loudly, not with explicit political commentary, but patiently, in the background, through the accumulation of specific documented detail that adds up, if you are willing to add it, to a case that stands up to examination. Burns is not exceptional because he is Burns. Burns is exceptional because he is fictional, which means the writers could be more honest about the mechanism than the real world usually permits. They could show you the biological weapons lab and the skeletons in the basement, and the deal with Abe and the weekly radiation treatments, and the contamination timeline, all of it laid out across hundreds of episodes, in a form that the audience can examine without the legal and political and social complications that examining the real-world analogs produces. That is what fiction is for, at its most serious level. Not to escape the real world, to show you the real world in a form that makes its structure visible. Burns is the form, the structure is what you take home, and Springfield is what the structure produces. Not a cartoon. The town you grew up in, wherever you grew up, whenever the thing in your town that functions the way Burns functions in Springfield was allowed to operate long enough and comprehensively enough to produce the specific, quiet, ambient quality of a place where certain questions are never quite asked and certain evidence is never quite connected, and the cooling towers on the skyline are just the skyline. Every town has a skyline. Look at yours. Now you know what to look for. Part M. A final night in Springfield. The closing of the case. You have been here a long time. Springfield has been keeping you company. The evidence has been laid out. The case is complete. The record stands. Burns is documented comprehensively and permanently as what the show has always known him to be, and has been building the case for across 3 decades of patient, methodical, comedically wrapped storytelling. Before you sleep, let us take one final walk through Springfield. Down Evergreen Terrace, where the Simpson house sits with its lights on and the television flickering through the window. Past Ned's house next door, the perfect lawn, the Bible verses in the window, the man inside still praying to the God who speaks to his neighbor but not to him. Down past the quick E-Mart, where Apu has been managing the night shift with the specific patience of a man who has spent 36 years in a town that was not quite what he expected and is making the best of it. Past Moe's, where the lights are low and the regulars are there and the conversation has the quality of people who have known each other too long to say anything new but cannot quite stand to be alone. Past Springfield Elementary, where the building is quiet and the classrooms are dark, and somewhere in a storage closet there might still be evidence of the oil well, Burns drilled beneath its foundations. Past the retirement castle where Abe is probably asleep, watching television in his sleep the way old people sometimes do, dreaming of a time before the deal, or not dreaming at all. And then up past the residential streets and the commercial district and the civic buildings. Up to the edge of town where the skyline is and the thing that the skyline is built around. The plant, the 2 cooling towers, the squat industrial mass between them. The chain link fence with the warning signs nobody reads. The cracked towers with the chewing gum patches that have been holding improbably all this time. The luminous rats in the walls, the skeletons in the basement, the reactor core where Homer once threw a donut to see if it would grow bigger. And at the top of it, behind the window that has never been cleaned, in the office that overlooks everything, a light is still on. Burns does not sleep the way ordinary people sleep. His rhythms are not ordinary rhythms. He is up, probably. He is always up, steepling his fingers, looking at the view, calculating. The town below him is quiet. The lights are going out in the houses, one by one. The people of Springfield are settling in for the night, absorbing whatever they have absorbed today, preparing for tomorrow, which will look very much like today, which looked very much like yesterday, which looked very much like the day before that. The loop holds, the plant runs. The water carries what the water carries. The fish in the river sleeps, 3 eyes closed. The sky above Springfield is the sky above Springfield. No moon tonight. Or maybe there is a moon. The show does not always agree on the weather or the sky or the season or the state or the geography. Springfield is wherever the story needs it to be. That is part of its design. But the cooling towers are always there, in every wide shot, in every establishing frame. The 2 towers and the building between them, and the light in the window at the top, and the man behind the glass. Charles Montgomery Burns, looking down at his town. Still there, still calculating. Still running the numbers on what Springfield owes him, and what it will pay, and how long it will keep paying, and what happens if it stops. The answer to the last question has always been the same. It will not stop. He has made certain of it. Sleep well, Springfield. The plant is still running. It always will be. End of complete script. Closing extension, the show's final argument. The Simpsons has a secret. Not one of the fan theories. Not one of the buried storylines or the canonical contradictions or the mysteries the show has been circling without resolution for decades. Something simpler than any of those. Something that is visible in the shape of the show if you know how to look at it, in the structure of what it chooses to show you, and what it chooses to pull back from, and the specific distance it maintains between those 2 things. The secret is that the show loves Springfield, not in the sentimental way that the show's more saccharine moments suggest, in the way you love something you can see clearly, including its damage. In the way you love a thing that is broken and beautiful at the same time, and you have spent 36 years watching it be both, and you have developed, through that watching, an understanding of it that goes past what the thing is and into what the thing means. Burns is part of what it means. Burns is the damage. He is the thing that broke the beautiful, and he is also, in a strange way that the show has been slowly revealing, the reason the show continues to have something to say. A Springfield without Burns would be a different town, a nicer town, a healthier town, a town where the fish have the normal number of eyes and the water is safe to drink, and Homer Simpson is whatever Homer Simpson might have been without the contamination and without the deal and without his mother's exile shaping the desperate, clinging, approval-hungry character he became. That town might not be interesting in the specific way that tragedy generates interest. The way that a story about a place that has been comprehensively failed by the most powerful person in its history generates interest. The way that the specific texture of Springfield's dysfunction, yellow and funny and sad and built on a foundation of damage that nobody quite understands, generates the kind of interest that keeps an audience returning for 36 years. Burns is the reason the show cannot end, not because the show needs him for the comedy, because the show is, at its deepest level, about him and what he represents and what it costs a community to have him at the center of its economic life. And that story has not resolved. It has not been resolved because the show does not permit resolution, because Springfield does not permit resolution, because Burns has made resolution impossible, and that impossibility is itself the most important thing the show is telling you. What is it telling you? It is telling you that this is how it works. That systems of unchecked private power in dependent communities do not resolve themselves. They persist, they outlast, they adapt, they absorb challenges and recover and continue. The three-eyed fish does not go away. The cooling towers do not come down. The water does not clean itself. The deal with Abe does not unhappen. The exile of Mona does not reverse. The cognitive damage in Homer's skull does not repair itself. The damage accumulates. The system continues. Burns is still at the window, and you, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world as you watch this, are watching a cartoon about a family in a town that does not exist on any map, and you are somehow, despite all of that distance and fictionality, feeling the weight of something real. That weight is what the show has been building for 36 years. That is the secret. You felt it. Burns made sure you would. Good night. The record of final accounting. We began with a silhouette on a skyline. 2 cooling towers and the building between them, rising above every rooftop in a town that does not appear on any map and somehow feels like everywhere. We end in the same place. Because that is what the loop does. It returns you to the beginning. It shows you the same image, the same skyline, the same towers, the same light in the window at the top, and it asks you whether you see it differently now. You should. You have been through the evidence. All of it. The 342 safety violations. The refusal to spend $56 million. The luminous rats and the chewing gum on the cooling towers and the plutonium paperweight and the skeletons in the basement. Blinky the three-eyed fish, pulled from the river and held up on a fishing line as evidence, then served at a dinner party to neutralize the politician who tried to use it. The biological weapons laboratory in a residential community, producing weaponized pathogens a few miles from where children were playing. Mona Simpson, kissing her sleeping son goodbye and vanishing into 27 years of exile because the man who owned the power plant made one phone call. The deal with Abe, trading a crime's evidence for a job that placed Homer in the contaminated facility for the rest of his working life. The 742 documented errors that accumulated without consequence because the deal required them to. The crayon in Homer's brain, the radiation in his water, the specific architectural, multi-generational damage done to one family by one man's decisions. The sun blocker, the machine that actually worked. The day Springfield went dark and the town finally gathered with weapons and someone, we still do not know who, pulled the trigger. The medical treatments every week, the glowing walk through the woods, the Three Stooges syndrome keeping everything in terrible equilibrium, Smithers managing the schedule, devoting a life, receiving almost nothing. The children born yellow into yellow Springfield, carrying in their neurology the evidence of everything their parents absorbed, going to school in a building whose budget was gutted by oil extraction from beneath its foundations, all of this is in the record, deposited across hundreds of episodes across 36 years, put there by writers who knew what they were building even when the audience did not, maintained across every season, every showrunner, every tonal shift and celebrity appearance and prediction and reset. The record is consistent. The evidence is overwhelming. The conclusion is unavoidable. Burns is the villain, has always been the villain. Not the surface villain, not the comedy villain, not the character who generates laughs through his contempt and his archaic references and his inability to remember the name of the man he has worked with for 3 decades. The actual villain, the one the show has been building for 36 years in the background detail and the accumulated evidence and the patient, methodical layering of harm upon harm upon harm. The case is complete. Springfield rests, the plant runs, Burns is at the window, and you know what you are looking at. That is enough. Sleep well,